you want to hear the Dave Olbrich origin story, I can try to give you a Reader's Digest version of that.
I was gonna say, actually, my first question literally is like, how did you get into comics? What got you interested in comics in the first place?
Um, I was a farm boy, uh, born in Northern Illinois, moved to Southern Minnesota early on. I had 3 real sisters and I had 5 foster sisters. And I lived 6 miles from anything resembling a town. And so I spent a lot of time alone with my imagination. And TV was my best friend. Oh my God. So once I discovered comics, sort of through the original animation, like, the Spider-Man cartoon show and the Fantastic Four cartoon show and all that stuff back then. I mean, even the Marvel superheroes were a big deal when I was real small. And then eventually it all came together. As soon as I found comic books, I started buying them up because I heard, sort of heard about it and stuff. And then I couldn't stop. They became my friends. They became all geeks know now about going down the rabbit hole and getting involved in a fandom. And we all did it separately, but I did it in isolation, right? I was literally in the middle of nowhere. To this day, the house I grew up on is 16 miles from anything that resembles a grocery store. So I was literally out in the middle of nowhere, and I didn't have any friends that shared my interests. So I had friends, but they were interested in fixing cars or how to run the tractor or all the chores and day-to-day stuff that people use to get by, right? So I spent summers baling hay and doing all that stuff. But I was reading comics like a madman. As every dollar I could get my hands on was going into comics, and I would store them in a little dresser drawer, a little dresser that my parents kept their TV on. Made my dad nuts. He hated it. But Dad and I had a great relationship, but he just didn't really understand. He had no idea what my attraction to comics was. Not the first clue. So so that was basically how I got into comics. When I got into my teenage years, when I started discovering girls and they were rejecting me, I started getting into cars, and of course, cars are expensive. The thing that kept me buying comics was Marv Wolfman's and Gene Colan's Tomb of Dracula, and Doug Moench's and Paul Gulacy's Master of Kung Fu. Those 2 series really kept me buying comics. Now, don't misunderstand. Those were the 2 I liked the best. But at that point, I was probably buying just about everything I could get my hands on. There was a little, right out the back door of the high school, there was an alleyway. And the alleyway, when the alleyway got to the street, if you took a left, you were at a small, really small convenience store. At that point, I'd never even been in a 7-Eleven, I don't think. Or there was nothing, no 7-Elevens or anything like a regular, what we know as a convenience store. There was nothing like that anywhere near my house. And I could walk down the alleyway, turn left, and go into this little tiny store where they had a little bit of everything. One of those places, little farm community. But right inside the door was the magazine rack. And there were 4 shelves on the bottom near the floor of all their comics. And that's the only thing I had access to. If the newsstand jobber didn't drop it off, I wasn't getting it. So, and I couldn't start until I got my car. And then I got my car and I found out there was the town, one of the big towns next over had a couple of better jobbers. So it was still newsstand comics. But one winter day, I got in my '68 Cougar, and after school, and understand at this point I'm working a job at night and going to high school, so I was constantly sleep deprived. But my grades were real good, so the school and my mom would let me skip half days here and there to catch up on my sleep. So I got in my car and I drove over to the next town in the middle of this snowstorm because it was comic book day. I'd said I'm going to get my comics that day, and there wasn't really a comic book day back then, but I decided the week before that was the day I was going. My schedule wasn't that flexible. I got in my car and I drove there, and there was a snowstorm. On the way back, I nodded off at the wheel, drove into the ditch in the middle of this blizzard, hit two giant like pieces of ice, pulled back up onto the road, got about 3 miles more down the road, and both the tires on that side of the car went flat. 80 mile an hour winds. It's probably 15 below with the wind chill outside my car.
Oh.
So I waited for a little while, tried to stay warm. Cops came by, picked me up, took me home. My dad was so mad. Oh my God. He was so angry. You did what? Because of what? So he and I got on our winter gear and went over and changed the tires and drove the car back. But he was so mad, and I was just this close to like dying in the freezing cold in Minnesota because I had to have my comic books.
It sounds like you loved your comic books, man. I know that feeling. And my dad's the same way. Like, we have this great relationship. And ironically, he bought me Dark Knight Returns when I was super young because he asked the guy at the bookshop, he's like, what's a good Batman book? And they were like, this. I was 7, if that tells you how little he knows about comic books.
Not really the best 7-year-old reading. But at some level, it kind of is, right? Because you feel all grown up. You feel like you're getting into, you're getting into something you shouldn't get into. It opens up your eyes.
Mind-blowing. He got me the complete Frank Miller Batman, which was like the Walden Books. It was the first collection that I really know of that was like, wide and out there and just spread everywhere. And I remember reading that and being like, normal Batman, normal. What is this? Oh, what is happening? Superman's getting hit with a bomb and there's, what? But me and my dad have this, he does not understand comic books. I recently got him to read Watchmen and Dark Knight Returns. And I remember going over to his house and he handed me the trade paperbacks back and he was like, I get it. Finally, I get it. Took me 30 years. All right. Now I understand why you used to shovel the driveway on on those Wednesdays to get to the comic shop. And it's like, yep, it had to happen, man. It had to happen.
I had this weird experience where I had almost exactly the same story, except it wasn't my dad. It was my high school principal. Like, I kept getting in trouble for reading comics in class. So I got sent to the principal's office. I said, look, this is what I love. And I think if I could get you to read just these 4 or 5 issues, you'll get it. And I gave it to him and he went crazy. He was just like, okay, I finally understand what the hell is going on with you and these things. Because you're right, that was really great.
That's so awesome.
Isn't that incredible? Yeah. And it was Master of Kung Fu 46 through 50.
See, and that should be like evident proof because Master of Kung Fu, while an amazing series, I might add, and I'm super happy it's finally getting a little bit of love with all this Shang-Chi movie spec stuff that's going on. Yep. But man, talk about it like a series that gets 0 love. If you can get people hooked on with like Master of Kung Fu, if you have your choice of like anything you want to throw at people, that should be just the proof you need that you can get in. There are comic books for everyone.
I think that's true. I think if the reader's open to it, I think you can find a comic book that's going to appeal to anybody. Yeah, I think that's true.
If the person recommending it truly loves comics and they know what they're talking about, which is something that I have always respected about you, because I read a ton of interviews. You popped up basically anywhere I turned during my childhood for about 6 or 7 years. Your name was
I'm really sorry about that. You deserve an apology. Stuck with my nonsense in your head.
Dude, you gave me sludge, so I am not going to complain about anything. That series, and I'll admit that I liked to bag on Malibu and Ultraverse because it just got trendy, man. It was like Liefeld. Yeah, let's just bag on that because that's 90s crap. And then I remembered, I was like, no, Sludge was a Malibu series. And that series, Steve Gerber, is a underrated freaking genius. But we'll get there. We will get to Steve. We will get there. So, speaking of your love of comics and turning your high school principal on to comic books,
yep.
It seems like you really channeled your love of comic books. And the first thing that I know of that you were doing inside of the industry was the Fantagraphics Amazing Heroes. Can you
Yep.
talk a little bit about
Well,
how you got involved?
let me give you the quick path from where we were just now to getting there, because it's not that long a story, really.
Absolutely.
1976, I go to I had relatives that lived in Northern Illinois, so I go and stay with them, and I go to the 1976 Chicago Comic-Con. And my goal was to talk to whoever would talk to me about what college I should go to or what field of study I should endeavor in so that I could have a career in comic books. And so I met Marv Wolfman and I met Don McGregor, and I talked to Marv briefly, and I asked him, what should I take? And he says, get into any other field that you want to. Comics are dying. So, but this was like a year before the direct market kind of took off and made all comics viable again. I mean, at 76, everything was in the death throes because all the stuff was disappearing from the newsstands, and the newsstands were saying, we don't want comics anymore. So I went back home, decided on a career in journalism, publications, that kind of stuff. I mean, that's what interested me. And then when I went to college, I went away to college to get a mass communications degree. Beginning of my senior year, a guy that that had a gold and silver shop opened a comic shop right in the town where my college was. Up until then, I was ordering all my comics mail order. Right? I would get a little order form, and I'd like one. I go to be this entire page of ones, right? And then I started selling them to my buddies a little bit, not much, but I'd give them my order form, and like, would you like some of these? They go, yeah, and so I'd buy them from them, and I'd get a little bit of a discount, whatever. But the guy opened a store, so I go into the store. Store looked amazing, and I said, well, actually the store was kind of a mess, but so I said to him, I said, look. And this shows how naive and dumb I was at that age. I said, look, if you'll sell me my comics wholesale, so it won't cost you anything, I'll come and run the store a couple hours every night after work.
You were young, weren't you?
See, I was. So that's what I did for like, I don't know, 9 months or so. But if I hadn't done that, I wouldn't have discovered Amazing Heroes, and I certainly wouldn't have discovered the Comics Buyer's Guide. And so I'm in the store doing orders or whatever. We're stocking the Comics Buyer's Guide, trying to sell it to customers or whatever. There's an ad in there. We need an assistant editor. Well, that's funny. I'm a journalism student looking for a job, and I'm in Wisconsin, and the Buyer's Guide is in Wisconsin. It's perfect, right? So I actually went and interviewed for the job, and I didn't get it. So then I thought, well, I need a job. I want a job in comics. I'm graduating from college. I don't like the job I got that much. Maybe I'm kind of hot shit in the fan editorial business. If I got an interview for the Buyer's Guide. So then I zapped off a letter to Fantagraphics. They said, meet us in Chicago. And they offered me a job, and the pay was terrible, but they threw in room and board. So that's how I ended up at Fantagraphics, supposedly as the managing editor of Amazing Heroes.
So I've talked to several people that have worked with Gary over the years in varying degrees. What was your experience like out at Amazing Heroes?
Well, it was tough because we weren't making any money, but it was also like the best kind of boys club, because it was just a bunch of comic book guys hanging around doing comic book stuff all day long. I mean, it made my fiance, who moved with me from Wisconsin to Connecticut, completely crazy. But we lived in the same house with Gary and 2 other employees in this big house in the suburbs of Connecticut.
Really? So you lived with him?
Oh, yeah.
Wow. Okay.
So he gave me my own room and because I had a wife with me, he gave me the one that I had its own private bathroom. So, I mean, it was a pretty nice deal. But like I said, the paychecks were terrible. But we were just making comics. I was making comics hand over fist. We were doing Amazing Heroes twice a month. So we were doing 24 a year. That's a lot of fan magazines, right? And then I would help out with other stuff. So we had Nemo, we had the Comics Journal, we were already doing Love and Rockets, we had Los Tejanos, we had lots of, I mean, there's just lots of publishing that was going on. And so it was just like it was said, it was a boys' club, lots of cursing, lots of loud music, and we were just trying to make ends meet and trying to get by.
So, was there anything that you worked on at Amazing Heroes? I know you just said you were involved with a lot of the other titles that Fantagraphics was involved with. Did you learn a lot during that period?
Oh my gosh, I learned so much. And one of the things I learned is you can have a career if you're willing to do the stuff nobody else wants to do. Right? So what I discovered was I had affinity for the logistics and the marketing and the sales and all that stuff. So instead of everybody else that kind of gets into comics thinks they're going to be a writer or occasionally an editor, lots of artists, nobody really wants to get into the nitty gritty nuts and bolts that isn't associated specifically with somehow affecting the career of a character, right? And I liked that stuff. I thought it was fun. So I took over all the advertising for Fantagraphics. Eventually, I took over all their distribution, handling of the distributors, and getting the solicitations out, and doing all the day-to-day stuff on top of whatever little I was doing for Amazing Heroes, and it worked out great. So the amount that you learned, the interesting thing is the stuff I learned there has absolutely the technical stuff I learned there, it's got absolutely no application now. All that technical stuff I learned has been completely wiped out by personal computers.
Oh man, it's a dying art. But I think that when you see people who can traditionally put together comic books, I think there's a difference in thought process that happens. And I don't know if it's because you guys have actually had to physically spend time thinking and analyzing so much how things fit together. But with people and personal computers and digital technology and art and writing, a lot of stuff feels so slick and rushed and hurried or completely overthought. And there's just something.
I think you're describing fandom, not so much the actual product. I think you're sort of describing the people, right?
Well, yes, but it seems like there was a point during the late 80s and the early 90s where technology and fandom and people involved in actually producing comics kind of convalesced at this point, just kind of prior and following the black and white explosion, where people had enough knowledge that if you had the skill, the intelligence, and the drive to do what other people didn't want to do, which was letter your book, lay it out, get everything looking like it didn't look like complete crap, knowing how registration works. Good luck getting all these kids with digital computers to understand how digital like layovers, like those acetates for colors. They would blow their brains out before they'd ever get that aligned right. And
my co-host on Geekview Tavern, Tom Mason, has been with me almost my entire career. I met him at Amazing Heroes. And then as soon as we started Malibu, he was my first call. It's like, we're going to start publishing comics books again. Come over here. Called him from a Jack in the Box. And he's been part of my life ever since then. We've been going to San Diego Con together for years and years. And so it's fun to do Geekview Tavern with him, but he used to do 2 or 3, he'd probably do, on top of his regular interior paste up work, he would probably do 2 acetate cutting covers for Fantagraphics every month.
No, thank you.
Yeah, it's something to see.
It really is. And I grew up in just outside of Sparta, so I got to see the actual printing plant where, I think like 70% of American comics were coming from at the time.
Yep.
And one of the coolest things about that was getting to see where they kept all the plates and the separation for the, the overlays and the colors and stuff. Because most of the kids my age did not understand that when they were looking at comics. And they didn't understand that when they saw Malibu, like, man, why does that color look different? But again, we will get there. So
We will indeed. So now I'm working at Fantagraphics, and that's where we're at in my career path, and everything's going fine. But before we get off the color overlay thing, do you know? Well, first of all, most people don't know that when you look at an old comic and you see the colorist, they're not actually applying the color to the art. What they're doing is they took a photocopy and they said, this is this color, and they had to code it based on how many blues, how many pinks, how much yellow would go into that box, right? So that's what they did, was they would do a color design and then they code it, and then they'd send it to a guy named Murphy Anderson. They would send it to Murphy Anderson, right? Murphy Anderson had an army of housewives who he would send a copy of the art to, and he would send them the supplies, and they would sit and cut rubylith and send the stuff back to him. So that's how the color actually happened, was this army of people that Murphy Anderson had at his disposal. He would send them the color design, he'd send them their supplies, and they would cut these 3 levels of rubylith to make sure the comics actually got colored, because then you could send those rubyliths to the printer, and they would shoot it 4 times, and then you could get a color proof.
Yeah, and for anybody listening to this who's like, yeah, but they didn't have that many colors back then in comics, so that couldn't have been too complicated. No, that makes things much more complicated. You have to think about how colors overlay, and because you don't have certain colors, you have to make those colors by mixing the colors, folks.
Right.
So that is the level of forethought that had to go into creating a comic book, which is a complete pain in the neck. But like I said, during the black and white explosion, I think they're kind of hit a point where people who were driven and intelligent enough had enough access to technology, and stuff was affordable enough that they were actually able to get stuff out on their own. And that is when the comic industry really started to change. It's what really spurred on the main guys to try different stuff, to branch out artistically and story-wise during the 80s. If anybody's wondering, like, where did Dark Knight Returns and Watchmen and Squadron Supreme and stuff come? It was not because Marvel was like, yes, I would like to tell a story about a post-apocalyptic universe full of dystopian, insane superheroes. No, guys, it was because people were making comic books that mattered. Fans. And fans have often done things quite a bit better than the professional industry has done things, which is one of the reasons I was super interested in talking to you so much, because you really did come up out of that old school fan scene and kind of build your way into the mainstream, and then just knock the mainstream down on its butt. And I loved that.
Well, I was still in lacrosse running the comic book store when Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles came out.
So you remember what that was like that, because that was a game changer.
Well, you know what's funny about that? It never really reached my store in lacrosse, because our fans didn't care about that, because they never read the fanzines, and they weren't plugged into any network that told them, oh yeah, the value of this is going up. But I saw it in the buyer's guide. I saw all sorts of stories about it. And then that, lasted about, from the time it was released until the black and white bust came from the black and white boom, would have been the endish of 86. So when we first started doing Malibu, we were still either cutting rubylith, or we were getting somebody to paint something underneath a black overlay, and then having both of those things color separated. So it was a whole different process. Computers were good at that point. Well, in 87, 88, 89, 90, computers were good for handling black and white stuff, but it was still expensive as all get out to do color. And there was no programs to do color. Like Steve Ollif was the first guy to do it, and he was, doing great, like really crazy stuff with the most archaic software ever. And remember, even when Todd launched Spawn, he got Steve Ollif to do his color, because color still hadn't progressed very well, even at the point when Image came out. So when those first Image books came out, was just the very tip of the iceberg, the very tip of the spear of computer coloring. Computer coloring really didn't develop until in any kind of sophisticated sense for another 18 months.
Yeah, I was going to say, because I know Ollif originally started using digital coloring technology because of his collaboration with Katsuhiro Otomo through Epic doing the reprints of Akira here in the US. And he had sent his samples into Otomo himself as a Marvel representative, and Otomo was supposed to pick guys. And he came across Steve's stuff and was like, that's the guy who's coloring my stuff. And that meant Steve had to go to Marvel and convince them to use digital coloring in '88, man. And I've read about how much of a headache that was. But Steve Ollif is a freaking god. That guy colored the Max. You can color.
And you know the best thing about Steve, he's a sweet dude. He's just the sweetest. Like I like him. I like him so much.
He is a absolute god in my mind. Like growing up, there was very few books where I got done reading them and didn't look in there and was like, oh, and Steve Ollif for Ollie Optics, you know, like it was Steve. Like people don't even remember Death of Captain Marvel, God Loves Man Kills, like all pre-computer. Yeah, even back then, Steve was owning colors.
Yep.
Sorry.
No, don't be sorry. I'll sit around and cheer about Steve Ollif all day. So that's fine with me.
I've been trying to get a hold of him. I am dying to interview Steve because I just want to crawl inside of that guy's head and learn like what spurred on. How did you know that computers were the future so much? How did you? They were like a second. It's boggling to me for someone who grew up back then because you think about like the guys who got sent to the moon with a computer that had the computing technology of a pocket watch.
Yeah.
And it's like, that's what computers were to me as a kid. That's how I thought of computers. I can't imagine. Where was your head, Steve? 30 years in the future. That's where you were.
When they first released Photoshop, Malibu was one of the most computer literate companies that existed in comics anyway. And we got somebody to Photoshop to contact us, and they sent a representative, and we sent probably a dozen staff, maybe more, to try to learn to go to one of these Photoshop things. Of course, the Photoshop teacher only knew how to alter existing photos. Like, okay, scan your picture of your daisy. Okay, now, once you've got your scan, you can change the yellow from really bright yellow to kind of orangey yellow, or you can change it to black and white. And it's like, oh, no. We have white pages, and we want to plop color into spots. And we want to be able to gradiate it and then put in special effects. And she had no clue what to do. But we all learned Photoshop directly from a Photoshop teacher within months of its initial release.
Wow. And that's hilarious because it's like everything that you just said is what Photoshop has become famous and known for.
Sure.
Sounds like they might have maybe learned a little bit of something from you guys while you were there learning from them.
Yeah, God only knows. It was a tsunami after that. I mean, once a few people started figuring it out, then it just rolled like crazy.
Okay, so jumping back in at Amazing Heroes, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Kirby Awards. And people, I think, today will probably know them a little bit better as the Eisners. Can you talk a little bit about how the Kirby Awards first came to be?
Sure. Yeah. It's not particularly rocket science. We at Fantagraphics, we were the so-called, we were really a boys club for sure. And Gary had a very serious goal of getting comics to be more seriously considered by at least academics, if not scholars. And I was more interested in getting them more seriously considered by the mainstream. And so every year, the Buyer's Guide did these fan awards. And we are all sitting around going, well, this is just a popularity contest by a bunch of people that don't know nothing. So you know what? Why don't we just create our own awards? And then somebody looked at me and goes, well, I'm too busy. Dave can do it. And I was pretty enthusiastic about it, frankly, because my dream was for the awards to get so popular that they'd be carried in People magazine or they'd be carried in Entertainment Weekly. And that has come to pass thanks to Jackie Estrada. So my dream for a professional set of awards has been realized, although the road was kind of bumpy along the way. So, I behaved badly because the Fantagraphics guys were behind helping put it together. And so we did it for a couple of years, and not all, but the vast majority of the professional feedback I got was no one's going to ever take these awards seriously as long as they're associated with Fantagraphics. Because it's such a small community that they'll always assume that if Gary and Kim have access to the awards, that they will jury rig them in some way. And not only is Gary a publisher, but he, has opinions about the difference between crap and not crap. Right? So even if the votes went, so you can see there's like a conflict of interest built right into it. Right? So that all kind of came to a head right around the time my wife got pregnant and I had to get out of Fantagraphics. And I think I did the Kirby Awards like one more year after. Don't quote me on any of this. The history is really fuzzy in my head. And if you ask any of my friends, I'll do my best, but my memory is like a sieve. So I'll do my best, but some of the details might get switched up and some of the timelines might overlap the wrong way. But anyway, my wife got pregnant. I had to leave Fantagraphics because Domino's Pizza offered me a job where I could make more money and have health insurance.
Wow.
I mean, we really were making no money. So as soon as when we moved to California from Connecticut, the only way to make ends meet was for me to work at Fantagraphics all day, 5 days a week, sometimes 6, and then deliver pizzas 3 or 4 nights a week. And my wife had to have a job too. And that was just to have a little shitty apartment. So once the owner of the Domino's Pizza store offered to give me a big raise and bring me on as management and offered to help pay for the baby that I couldn't pay for in terms of just the hospital bills, I had to go. So that didn't last. That was kind of a nightmare, but it got me through, but it also got me out of Fantagraphics. And like I said, I think I did another Kirby Awards 1 year after I left Fantagraphics, but don't quote me on it. So I had all that feedback and I was committed to the awards. I really wanted them to be successful. And I didn't want, now that I was out of Fantagraphics, I didn't want the weight of having Fantagraphics associated with it, right, continue to weigh down. If the growth and the respectability of the awards is constantly going to be questioned or retarded or held back by its association, then maybe we should look at doing something else. And so I wanted to do the Kirby Awards without Fantagraphics. So I started down that path. Like, okay, I've been the lead person. I've done all the work. I've done all this stuff. Now I'm not at Fantagraphics anymore. Nobody at Fantagraphics is going to do the Kirby Awards. There's nobody there that's going to do it. They don't even know what to do for the most part. And if they did, there's nobody there that wants to do it, and there's no money in it. So, and in fairness to Fantagraphics, they didn't pay us a lot of money because they weren't making a lot of money. It wasn't like they were like rolling in cash and and they weren't sharing. That wasn't the deal. It was just a small company and there wasn't a lot of money to go around. So I tried to continue the Jack Kirby Awards without Fantagraphics, and Fantagraphics got mad and said that they owned them. And I said, no, F you, I want to own them. And then I got a call from Jack Kirby saying, I'm not getting, I love you. And I love the guys at Fantagraphics because we all helped with the whole getting his artwork back and we were all pals. It was great. And Jack said, look, I'm not going to get into a middle of a pissing match between you and Fantagraphics. Like, if you guys can come to an agreement, great. But if you can't, then I need to take my name off of them. And I said, I'm sorry, but I understand exactly how you feel. That's what we'll do. And, weeks later, I'm like, it's not fair. The industry doesn't have a respectable set of awards. Let's just start over with somebody else's name. And the Fantagraphics can't lay claim to it. They can't hold them back because they're because of their reputation and their standing in the business. And so then I started them but at that point I was already working for Malibu or Eternity or whatever we were calling ourselves at that moment, because we only had like 17 names, for God's sake. By then I was already working there, and I did it 2 or 3 years there. And then it became clear, this is too much work. I want to grow Malibu. I love the awards, but we're back to the same kind of problem. It's not Gary that's the conflict of interest now, but I'm the publisher at Malibu, for crying out loud. If we ever publish something that's up or wins, is it going to look like it's tainted? So then I talked to Will, and Will and I talked about it. We said, well, first of all, and Will, they sort of said this from the very beginning, if we do it, it should be some sort of nonprofit. And I was like, well, setting up a nonprofit is going to be a ton of work. And then we came to the conclusion that giving the awards to an existing nonprofit would be the way to go. And so we turned it over to the nonprofit that runs the San Diego Comic-Con. And then, because I didn't have time or energy to make it happen anymore, I handed it off to Jackie Estrada, and she's just done amazing things with it. Just about everything I dreamed of that would come from setting up the awards has come true.
The Eisner Awards are very important. I don't even want to, because they're not like the Academy Awards or anything, where I don't feel like it's a popularity contest. But growing up with the Comic Buyer's Guide, I always just saw the hot names. The guys that like 10 years later, it would have been Todd McFarlane and Jim Lee and Rob Liefeld and stuff. But it's the hot guys at the time. And I remember just wondering why a lot of series got snubbed. And then the Kirbys came along and the Eisners came along. And I think that has been a very important part of the industry being able to take itself seriously. That's really interesting to hear, because I've heard a lot of people who have an axe to grind with Gary. And I feel like Gary's an extremely important part. Groth, for anybody listening to this, the guy who's
right, yeah. The guy that runs Fantagraphics, and the guy that has been the driving force behind the entire editorial vision of the Comics Journal since the day he bought it.
Yes, and he is also been one of the driving forces behind preserving and doing a lot like what I'm doing now, where you conduct interviews and you get behind the scenes, you learn the truth according to people and catalog that for further generations. It's something that's indispensable. But Gary is an extremely, as you put it, his personality is very extreme.
He's a divisive guy for sure, and he and I have been at odds for, well, since I lied to him about who was funding Malibu. So, we've been at odds for a long time, and we did not treat the Comics Journal very well after when we were running Malibu. We just didn't. We'd get requests for information, and we had a standard thing we'd send back to them, which basically said, we're sorry. We appreciate that you're just trying to do your job, but we do not consider the Comics Journal a legitimate source of news. So,
wow. Okay. Yeah. So,
mostly the truth is, in retrospect, we only believe that because we didn't feel it was necessarily for us to explain ourselves to Gary. And Gary already had an axe to grind with us. So why would we feel like he was going to treat us fairly?
And he wouldn't have. It's Gary Groth. Like, if he has an axe to grind with you and he wants to drag your name through the mud, any opportunity you give him, he will do that. And in a very intelligent way, I might add.
Well, and in all fairness to Gary, he's also willing to publish stuff that if he thinks it's thoughtful enough that disagrees with him.
Absolutely. Look at the Howard Chaykin interview, the very first Howard Chaykin interview where him and Howard go at it, just back and forth. He does an addendum interview. Howard slams on the Comics Journal, literally undermines everything that it is about and calls it like a childish, infantile magazine. And it does not get much more insulting than that. And I know, Howard and Gary are old friends from years and years, but still, I think printing stuff like that should go a long way in kind of alleviating some of what people think of as Groth's like overshadowing personality. Because he's very into critical writing. When I was talking to William Messner Loebs not too long ago, he worked for Gary and he was telling me...
And Gary was very good to Bill.
He was. And
was my experience anyway.
And Bill said that. He went out of his way to point out that Gary's a very cool guy. And that a lot of people misinterpret Gary because he's got this like very critical analytical mind, and that's what he reads. He doesn't read anybody who's not an author, who's not critical and analytical.
He doesn't come off very well in person either. He's not he's not a touchy-feely personal, he's got some personality quirks that keep him at a distance from people he shouldn't be at a distance from.
Yeah. So you're working for him, you leave, you get this offer, you get a little bit more money out at your pizza job, and then
wait, let me tell you the Walter Simonson story, because it's like I feel like it's the origin of me in some level. So right after I get there, Kim and Gary get together and go, you know what would be really great? We should get an interview with Walter Simonson for Amazing Heroes. And Kim was like, Walter Simonson hates us. You know what else? He doesn't know Dave. We'll send Dave into New York to talk to and get an interview with Walter, and then we'll put it in Amazing Heroes. And we're not that 100% sure that Walter knows that we're amazing, that Amazing Heroes is us, right? So I go to the convention. Walter's on a panel. I approach him after the panel. I say, can we talk about having an interview? He said, sure, absolutely. Who's it for? And I said, for Amazing Heroes. And he says, hang on for a second. I got to talk to this guy, and then I'm going to come back and talk to you. I said, okay. So I stand there and I just wait for Walter. And he goes and talks to his friends, and he comes back to me and says, come over here. I want to talk to you for a second. And we were in somewhere in New York, and we went into the hallway and then into a stairwell in this large building where they're having this comic gathering. And he and I sat in a stairwell and probably talked for 90 minutes. And his basic, well, it probably wasn't that long because he didn't have that much to say, because the truth of it is he was like, I'm not going to give you the interview you're asking for, and here's why. And so here I am straight off the farm, but through college, my first comic book job, one of my first assignments, and I fail at what my boss has sent me to do. But Walter Simonson, one of the biggest guys in the business, treats me like a professional. And to this day, I've got a really great relationship with Walter Simonson.
Walt seems like one of the coolest guys ever, man.
Here's a tip. Always say Walter.
Walter?
Yeah. Yeah, he's not a big fan of Walt. I mean, it's not a big deal. He doesn't bother to correct. He doesn't bother to correct people, but I know that's the case.
No, that's awesome, because I always see him referred to as Walt. And like one of the big things that I took away, I watch a Cartoonist Kayfabe. I don't know if you check out their YouTube channel at all.
I do occasionally if the person that they're interviewing is of interest enough to me. Yeah, I do.
Yeah, and I really respect Ed and Jim. And one of the things that I do try to take away from them, they said, because they're professionals, they've worked with everyone, and they're like, even they won't call Louise, and I've made a big rule about this long ago, even they won't call Louise Simonson Wheezy.
Right.
I am not Wheezy's friend. I don't think that's
right.
I haven't earned the right, and like that's a good thing to know about Walter, because right. I respect his work an inordinate amount. I grew up on his run on Thor, rescuing that character from the depths of obscurity.
Yeah, he is literally one of the best people in comics.
He seems that way, and like everything about him is so intelligently thought, down to his signature.
You mean the Brontosaurus? Yeah, it's great, isn't it?
When I found that out, I was like, "Yep, I have to do a video about this." So I did this big interview about this big video about Walt Simonson's signature, and everybody was like, on the comments, like, "Holy God, it's it!" And I'm like, "Yeah," and that's because he went to school for this, and he's so intelligent. So, and might be trying to get a hold of Walter about an interview because I do love his work. So I very much appreciate the tip.
Well, I was so happy when Malibu published Bravura that we were able to publish Star Slammers, because it was a dream come true to be able to publish some of Walter's work. Yeah.
I was going to say, and we'll talk about Bravura too, because like that's one of the things. When I was looking at your Wikipedia article, they have Bravura and Guerrilla Comics listed as coming out the same year. And I was like,
coming out the same year?
Yep.
That's way wrong.
At the turn of the century, Dave Olbrich. And I was like, wait a minute. I thought Empire was
Please.
Yeah, I was like, I thought Empire and stuff was like 2000, and everything else was. I remember Bravura.
I don't have that good. I don't have that good of memory, but even I know that's effed up.
Wikipedia is the enemy of true information. So
don't say that. I lean on it all the time for stuff I need.
Well, and it's great for a jumping off point. If you go there and just look at their annotations, like the articles that people are citing as references, and you use that, it's wonderful for research, because then you're not getting crap.
Right.
But everybody else, it seems like, is just copying and pasting stuff, and they can't even be bothered to do that right. So
sounds like you've got an opinion about this.
It might have been that when I started off, I was like, well, Wikipedia will make things so much simpler, because you and I come, and I'm not, implying that I am, from the same generation as you, but we both come from generations pre the internet, where
right.
like books, hard physical copies of things, you had to have them, and they were expensive, and it was not easy to get them, and there wasn't many of them, and that information was very biased and came from a very small select amount of sources. So when I started this channel, I was like, Wikipedia, I'll just get on there and that'll make everything. And, Grand Comic Books database. No, yeah, you find out quickly why it's not everybody who has a historical research channel.
Yeah, and the information's really fractured, and a lot of times it's wrong. That's true too. Yeah,
and even when it's right, it's completely out of sequence. It's like Bravura and Guerrilla Comics. Wait a minute. Bravura started in '94 and Guerrilla was 2000. That seems like a tad bit of
it's a big gap. Yeah.
Yeah, and saying that was after Malibu. I'm pretty sure
Bravura was Malibu. Yeah.
I was going to say, I'm pretty sure I remember the Malibu M on those Bravura releases. Yep. And speaking of Malibu, let's kind of get into that. So
okay.
Kirby Awards, Eisner Awards, you get your raise at the pizza joint.
I get fired from the pizza joint. So I get fired from the pizza joint, and I'm collecting unemployment, desperately trying to find a job. There was a big executive job that came up working for all the distributors. The distributors wanted to have, like back then, there was like 12 distributors, and they wanted to have somebody to run their organization for them. So I tried out for that. Because I couldn't afford to fly to Hawaii, I didn't get that job. So I started looking around to see what was even around, and I noticed there was a distributor on the other side of Los Angeles. And I sent him a resume, and he actually contacted me back. And he said the reason he contacted me back was he'd never gotten a letter. He remembered when I left Fantagraphics, because I remember I was their distributor liaison person, right? He remembered me because I sent him a personal letter saying, I'm leaving Fantagraphics. Here's who the next person is that's going to do the distribution stuff. Here's exactly what's going on with your account. And so he thought that was really good customer service. So he hired me to work at his warehouse, and that was Scott Rosenberg.
Okay. So
I became the comic guy, and he bought me my first Mac Plus.
Wow.
So that would have been 1986.
Man, back when computers were, that was.
So they just released the first laser printers, so you could actually put something on your computer screen and print it out and have it not be dot matrix crap, right? Remember hearing those dot matrix printers? remember the pinwheels?
Oh,
Like
my.
all the paper had they looked like movie strips, except they were really wide, right?
I was going to say,
and then you would get them off there, and you'd have to peel those things off so that they didn't have the dumb holes on the sides. Yeah, they just released the first laser printers, and those things were freaking magical. There was only 12 fonts, but it was still magical, and there was almost no software. I mean, it was Excel version 1 for the Mac. It was crazy. So anyway, I'm down at the warehouse, working there for about 6 months. It's an hour drive at 4:30 a.m. It's almost 2 hours at 8 a.m. to get to this job from my house. So I'm going in early just to avoid all the dumb traffic and that kind of thing. But I've been there about 6 months, and Scott came, we're sitting around having pizza after a particularly successful day of loading boxes into retailers, station wagons. And he says, well, what do you think you want to be doing in 5 years? And so here was my thought. I told him the truth, but let me tell you how I got there. For the last 6 to 9 months, I'd been watching all this as a distributor. I've been watching all the solicitations come in from all these comic book companies that were, both ramping up and starting to die. It was like right around the peak of the black and white boom, right? And I was going, these guys are knuckleheads. I worked at Fantagraphics. I know what this takes. These guys are a bunch of screw-ups. It really wouldn't take that much for somebody to do this right and beat these guys at their own game, because literally it was Marvel, DC, maybe Eclipse, maybe First, and then a laundry list of rank amateurs, right? So I said to him, I would like to get back into comics because I think I could do it better than most of the people that I see trying to sell us stuff. And 2 weeks later, he called me into his office and said, okay, if you'll run it, I'll pay for it.
Wow, that's a lot of faith.
So the next 2 weeks or so, on the way down to work, I was like, okay, what am I going to call this thing? What am I going to call this thing? And it ended up being Malibu, because on my way to work, I had to drive by the Malibu Canyon exit. And Malibu was great because it had a bunch of things going for it. One, there's no question that we're a West Coast company. Marvel, DC are East Coast companies, and we're named Malibu. We're clearly not on the East Coast, right? So it fixes us geographically. Mm-hmm. Second of all, it had the right number of letters and cool letters. It wasn't a real long word. You do a bunch of cool stuff with it. And it was MAL, which would be alphabetically right before Marvel MAR. And it didn't make any unnecessary promises about what the content was going to be. It wasn't hot comics. It wasn't cool comics. It wasn't innovative comics. It wasn't any of those dumb shit names that people were picking to basically invite unnecessary criticism. You know what I'm saying? If you call yourself Hot Shit Comics and your comic isn't hot shit, you're just inviting unnecessary criticism because you're making promises you can't keep. And that was the one thing that Malibu always based its business operations on. Never make promises you can't keep. So anyway, that's the origin of calling it Malibu.
No, and it's really cool that you bring up promises that you can't keep, because one of the things that I respect, during the 90s, deadlines became almost a like. Well, it's funny now looking back on it, but the more that I've dove back into, like, why do I not like the 1990s? Was it the art? Yeah, I didn't really like a lot of the art going on. Was it the stories? Yeah, a lot of the stories were kind of pedantic, retread crap. But those are both the case for a lot of periods when I'm reading comics. Why did
that's an excellent point, actually.
I try to tell people that. They're like, everything on the stand today sucks. I'm like, no, everything you read sucks because you won't pay enough attention to go find something you like. And that's always been the case. Stop whining. But you can't have deadlines and then completely ignore them to such an extent that a year or 18 months will pass and you get out 6 issues of a series, which are insultingly bad anyway. And Malibu always came through. And not like, oh yeah, well, you guys can tell like they were 2 weeks behind on this issue, so they called in this guy. You guys really held yourselves accountable, and all the way throughout that big spec boom where it was just about getting as many books out onto the stand as possible and throwing shit into people's faces, you guys never seemed to play into that. I respected the crap out of that. And it's really cool to hear that it started that early in the life of Malibu.
Yeah, some of the other stuff that I learned at Fantagraphics, that was one of them. Keep your goddamn promises.
And Bill said the same thing. That was something he learned from Gary. Like, if you say something, be a man of your word, follow up on that. It is very important, and that is the way you will make it in the industry, because it means a lot more in many cases than doing higher quality work.
Oh, that's true. That's absolutely true. Yeah.
So during the early years of Malibu, you were talking about Scott, and he was very pivotal. We
couldn't have done it without him.
Yeah, he was the money behind everything, and it turned out that he had several other.
Oh yeah, no, I didn't learn about that till we were well down the road. So at one point we had a discussion. Was once I found out the kind of shenanigans he was up to in terms of owning 4 or 5 other publishing imprints, and he actually ran a backroom business operation to keep them all on track. So here's the way it worked. He had these editorial pods that were just naming themselves randomly, because he found out that if you came up with a new publisher name and you released a new book, it would sell more, a few thousand copies more than if you were an existing publisher and came up with a new publishing name. So it was this really bad, like, shell game, right? So, but he had these editorial pods. I think he had like 3 of them before us. And so the editorial pods, all they did was come up with editorial ideas and try to get the pages completed. Well, that's only a small slice of running a publishing company. Right? You got to deal with the printer. You got to deal with the distributor. Got to deal with shipping. I mean, there's lots of other stuff that has to be dealt with, employee stuff and all that stuff, right? So Scott set up a separate company that was doing all of that for the editorial pods. So it was called Guaranteed Services. I don't even know what that means. It's the most mysterious name for a company ever, Guaranteed Services. But there you go. And so what they would do is they would handle all of the business stuff so the editorial pods could concentrate on generating IP. I'm sorry, intellectual property for those of us outside the bubble. Sorry. So when I discovered that, I had a meeting with Scott and I said, look, I'm going to set up my office near my house so I don't have to commute anymore, because I didn't want that 90-minute commute. And Tom's going to come work with me, and you could never have an office in my office. We have to be separate, because you've got Sunrise and you've got those other companies and you've got your own set of problems. And if you expect Malibu to survive, we have to distance ourselves from you as much as possible and all the problems you're having. That didn't last very long. In all fairness, and it was probably an unfair thing to ask in the grand scheme of things, but Tom and Chris and I ran the front end operations and the backroom operations of Malibu, and Scott was responsible for the lawyers and the bankers and all of the nitty gritty of that stuff. And he was in charge of HR and that kind of thing, which we routinely violated, by the way. we didn't learn anything from being at Fantagraphics in terms of being grown-ups. We were still pretty immature kids at that point, but we had our own funny book company, and we were staying alive. We were paying ourselves and keeping the lights on.
So I know there was Eternity, there was Aircel,
every single one of those names has a different weird origin. If you want me to go into them all, I can, but Eternity was one of the original editorial pods. Mm-hmm. And when Scott was like, Those guys don't know what they're doing. Tom and Dave know what they're doing. Tom and Dave and Chris know what they're doing. Why am I letting that editorial pod eat up so much of my time? I'll fire those guys. Oh, by the way, what's going to sell more, an Eternity comic or a Malibu comic? Well, at that point, it was Eternity. So we just absorbed the Eternity name and used it for almost everything for a while. And for a while, we were Malibu Comics, but all the stuff was branded Eternity. And then Adventure Comics was its own imprint that was run by Steve Milo. When he wanted to get out, Scott wanted to grab up whatever goodwill was still inherent in Adventure Comics and publish some of those titles. So that's how we got Adventure Comics. Same thing with Aircel. Aircel was Canadian, was a Canadian air conditioning company who got into comics because the owner had befriended Barry Blair, who is a controversial figure, but really productive and generally a personable guy and reliable as heck. He started selling a bunch of comics, and they also had Dale Keown comics and some other stuff, right? So when Ken Campbell was his name, when Ken Campbell decided he wanted to get out of comics, then Scott said, Barry, you bring your editorial pod, and if you'll produce X number of titles every month, then we'll send you X number of dollars every month. So everyone, all that stuff was mostly, we had a company that was well run from sort of top to bottom. And then there's all these other ones that either guys wanted to get out or it was a mess or whatever. And so we just started like, is there goodwill still in the name? Yes, there is. Okay, we'll take it. We'll take it. And then we started creating our own, like Platinum and all this other stuff. So yeah. Did that answer your question? I kind of went a little crazy there. Sorry.
No. Absolutely. That's exactly what I was wondering about, because I think one of the big problems that some people hit is like with Scott being involved with so many other companies, I think people get kind of confused whether or not when things convalesced with Malibu, because I've even heard people talk about you in reference to the original The Men in Black series. And I was
that
like,
was me.
Yeah. And I'm like, yeah, so do you guys know the connection? And they're like, no, because I thought Dave Olbrich worked for Malibu, but then it's Aircel. So we're not. And I'm like, well, yeah, but Aircel was, and so, no, I really
By the time we released Men in Black, Aircel was Malibu, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I don't think a lot of people know that. I hear people talk about The Men in Black as like being this like long lost, forgotten independent comic that nobody in the industry worked on, and I'm like, no guys, sorry, not the case. It's just a weird little imprint thing from the 80s and 90s. Now I'm kind of used to that because you just had to keep an eye out. That we remember with the implosions and the booms.
Right. Well, you look at two of those imprints we got, Aircel and Adventure, we got because guys got into the business. They were starting to make money. As soon as they started to lose money, they wanted to get out. And so we just took them over.
So
we just absconded with the name. I mean, we were Malibu, but there was a stretch when we weren't publishing anything that said Malibu on it. I mean, it said Malibu in the Adisha, but we had a solicitation for all of our Eternity comics. We had a solicitation for all of Adventure comics. And we had a solicitation for all of our Aircel comics. And so periodically we would shift gears and try to figure out, okay, we need these imprints to have an identity, which was really all well and good, except we changed our mind about every year or so. So the identities didn't stick and they changed so often that people couldn't really keep track. So I think if you look at the original, if you look at Planet of the Apes and Ape Nation and Alien Nation that we did, I think those are all branded Aircel maybe or Adventure. I don't remember which. Those weren't Eternity comics. We wanted to turn one of the imprints into nothing but like licensed books.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember because Eternity was basically all your superhero stuff at that point, right?
Well, Eternity was like everything else. So it was like all of the reprints and all the newspaper reprints, okay. And then stuff like Robotech the Sentinels was always Eternity.
So can you talk a little bit about how and when everything kind of started to convalesce into Malibu?
Well, it became clear at some point along the process that maybe we should start taking credit and getting everything under one umbrella, mostly because we were starting to look at real growth, not, comic book indie title growth. And so we really wanted to make sure that if we were Malibu, we needed to make it clear on the books, because ultimately we need to make it clear to lawyers and bankers and movie agents and all those kinds of people exactly what was going on. If you go to a comic book store and you pick up the Men in Black and it says Aircel on it, it seems to me it's a reasonable expectation to believe that was a company that was publishing an Aircel book. And you had to really dig deep into the indicia to see that Malibu was responsible. So we started to figure out pretty quickly that the short-term bucks of branding those imprints was probably less in our long-term interests than taking credit for everything we did and then starting to weed out the stuff that we didn't want to be known for. So that was basically part of it. And also the image thing came in really quickly right around the same time.
So let's talk about whenever I bring up Malibu, there's a couple of series that people constantly talk about, and I think a lot of people kind of have tunnel vision as far as Ultraverse goes, but X Mutants was a very well written series. And
which one? The Ron Lim one from 1986 or late 85, or the one that we relaunched in color?
I was going to say, I grew up on I didn't even know about the Lim stuff until I got older. I just grew up on the reprints. But that was one thing that I wanted to talk about. At one point, I read an interview with Scott where he said, I think you guys had a $400 marketing budget for the first issue of X Mutants, and that was kind of like the series that kicked stuff off for you guys. Can you talk a little bit about X Mutants and what happened with that series? Because like you said, there's that previous Ron Lim version, and then I know it went to like Pied Piper Publications for a little while. And
yeah, I'm actually not that certain about a lot of that stuff, because the original Ron Lim, David Campiti, David Lawrence version of X Mutants all came out before Malibu existed. And I didn't know that Scott was basically responsible for it. So I wasn't in any of those meetings or privy to any of that stuff, right? And when Scott decided to sort it out, however he did with Campiti and Lawrence, and Ron really wasn't a part of that. It was mostly Campiti and Lawrence. When he wanted to sort it out and get the rights back, I wasn't part of that deal either. It was just like, yep, I worked it out with the guys, whatever. We're gonna own X Mutants. So X Mutants was right part of the tip of the spear of the big black and white boom that saw Radioactive Hamsters and Boris the Bear. And when you publish a black and white comic and it sells 100,000 copies, you might as well be printing money at that point, because black and white, especially if it's on, even in paper, doesn't matter that much, but printing in black and white and selling lots and lots of copies is pretty lucrative if you price it right. Color is a lot more expensive, and if you sold as many copies in black and white as they were selling in color, and they were selling sometimes more, it really was like printing money, and that's the reason so many people jumped in, and that's the reason it crashed, right? You had this little boat of fans who said, yeah, I'll buy black and white comics, and then as soon as the prices started to go up, the fans got a little bit bigger, but you were still 8 million people jumping into the boat, and it was just too much. But it's free enterprise. That's the way it works, right? I mean, every industry has to exist with certain level. If it's going to have a high end and a middle end, it's got to have a low end, and it's got to tolerate certain levels of crap, or else you don't have enough money in the system to fund great stuff. I mean, it's just that simple.
The other series I wanted to ask about, because everything was kind of tied into that black and white explosion, was Dinosaurs for Hire.
Yep.
By Tom Mason.
Yep.
And that series, I think it could have really easily just been interpreted as like very tongue-in-cheek parody of the black and white Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles thing that was going on. But a lot like Radioactive Black Belt Hamsters, I think it kind of elevates itself a little bit beyond the source material in a lot of ways. Can you talk a little bit about how Dinosaurs for Hire felt very different from the other stuff that was on that early wave of Malibu releases?
Yeah, it was probably in the first 5 months of us publishing, something like that. It started out as a book that was going to go to another publisher that Tom was working on, which was based on, you've seen the pictures of Elvis shaking hands with Richard Nixon, right? And Nixon deputizing him as a member of law enforcement, right? There's this weird moment in history. So Tom wanted to do what if that actually turned into something comic, and he called it Elvis Undercover. Well, he couldn't avoid being sued by the Presley estate. So he sat around for a while, and he came in, he goes, Dave, I think I want to turn Elvis into 3 smart talking dinosaurs. I said, okay, try that. That sounds like fun. So that's literally the origin of Dinosaurs for Hire.
That's interesting. I didn't know it started off as another book, let alone about Elvis Presley.
Yeah, and you can tell that Tom really didn't, like, he had one story in him. He didn't really know what to do after that. Cause I think it's either the second or third episode of Dinosaurs for Hire. They're already fighting Dracula. I mean, you know what I'm saying? Like there wasn't a story arc that was laid out based on the creation of the characters. Like, ooh, we're gonna have them do this long involved thing, and a bunch of stuff goes on. Oh no, it was he was already doing basically hour-long TV shows as comics.
I love Dinosaurs. That first volume of Dinosaurs for Hire is absolutely incredible. And for anybody who's watching this that has not checked it out, I do highly recommend going and checking out that original Dinosaurs for Hire, because it is like just the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles to the absolute next level, mixed with everything that was the best about outlaw comics at the time.
Yeah, it's very weird. And I don't know if it was the black and white one or the color one, but we got in trouble with Dark Horse for one of them. Because Tom did this gag that we all thought was uproariously funny, and Dark Horse didn't. Where the bad guy has knocked out the other 2 dinosaurs, and the third one is sort of low on energy, and it's about to be over. And he takes one last swing at the bad guy and hits him, and the guy flies across the room and smashes into a bunch of stuff and breaks down a wall. And the other dinosaurs go, "What did you hit him with? Do you have a roll of quarters?" And the guy opens up and he goes, and there's a rock in his hand. He goes, "No, it's Mike Richardson's ego."
Oh my. Tom Mason with the big balls coming out swinging there.
It still makes me laugh. We had a little discussion. Should we really do this gag? Yeah. Who cares? It's just a joke. I think Mike's probably forgiven us a long time ago for that, but it did ruffle a few feathers at the time. And I still find it a funny gag.
I'll admit to laughing a little bit there. So you guys did a lot of licensed properties, like the Robotech stuff that we were talking about. You guys had kind of like the next evolution of the classic illustrated stuff with the Frankenstein and Dracula. I think you got Sherlock Holmes, couple of things like that.
Yep.
And when I was a kid, it seemed to me like it almost diluted the name, but when I was reading interviews with you, you talked about orphan titles.
Yep.
And your idea on this idea of orphan titles, and I was wondering if you would talk about the licensed properties and your thought process on orphan titles, because I thought that was extremely intelligent.
Well, thanks. There's two aspects of it. One of the major reasons to do licensed titles, because there's no money in them. I mean, because after you paid your writer and your colorist and after you've paid the talent, right? And after you get your sales in, there might be a little bit of money in it. But you got to realize that the person you're getting the license from also takes a big chunk. So they're significantly less profitable on a title by title basis. So one of the calculations you have to make is, if I'm doing a Star Trek, or if I'm doing a Robotech, or if I'm doing a Captain Harlock, if I do those books, am I going to get those audiences to read those books? And let's say you do. You can put your ads for your other titles and expose those readers to books that you don't have to pay licensing royalties on. So that's one of the calculations you have to make when you decide, all right, are we going to go broke doing it? No. Okay. Are we going to make a little bit of money and contribute to payroll? Yes. Ooh, can we advertise anything we want on it? Yes. All right. Now we're talking. So that's one of the first calculations you have to make. The second calculation, and this doesn't really apply to licensing as much as it does everything else, and it's kind of like when we were talking about coming up with brand identities for the imprints, which is, you don't want to ever, if you can help it, you don't ever want to create an orphan title, because you can only sell it once. And so if you know somebody, and this is the reason that sometimes publishing gets bloated and gets out of control, and it's the same reason people make sequels. It's like, if you know somebody likes something, or they like this particular thing for whatever those reasons are, why in the world wouldn't you want to give them another one? If you can make another one, why wouldn't you want to give them another one? If you can make another one after that, why wouldn't you want to give that to them? I mean, if they're getting what you want, what they want, and you're able to keep your lights on and keep your employees paid, seems to me that's a good strategy. And so if you're going to do any kind of one-off, especially something like we did Frankenstein and Three Musketeers and all these sort of classic stuff that's in the public domain, we wanted to be able to go to a book buyer and say, look, if you go to a bookstore, you don't want to just sell them one book. Well, they want to know what category it goes in. All right. Well, we have, by having a line, then you've got a category of books that can in the bookseller's mind be racked side by side, in the hopes that if they like this one, maybe they'll also be interested in that one. So that works at the bookstore level as well. So if you give them an orphan, generally they don't know what to do with it, and there's no upside to it to them, because they can only sell it once, and it doesn't drive any other sales. So if you've got 5 books, it's a lot easier to get attention for 5 books that look like they kind of go together than it is one book, for all sorts of different reasons. Did that make sense?
Oh yeah, absolutely. When I heard you talk about orphan titles, everything about the licensed properties clicked for me, and I picked up a lot of my old Malibu stuff and was flipping through there and just looking at the ads, and the level of thought process that you guys put into your cross promotion was almost unparalleled. Like, hey man, when you picked up Marvel Comics and I think a lot of us fondly remember these things, but like, remember the Hostess, the Hostess ads from all the Marvel stuff? As a kid, I was like, well, awesome. It's a Hostess, it's a Hostess ad. It's got Spider-Man. I can see the cross appeal in this. This works. And then that stuff disappeared. During the 80s, it was like, just, okay, here's a new video game, or this cool thing, this cool thing, this cool thing. And I always felt like Marvel and DC would have been much better served to be like, if you're reading Superman, then you probably also like Superboy, which means you probably also like Legion of Superheroes. So we should put Legion of Superhero ads into Superman and Superboy, which is what Malibu did, but no one else was thinking about it like that. I mean, the closest I ever saw was Marvel being like, okay, and now here's a bunch of like really cool, like, Venom in every book because everyone loves Venom and Ghost Rider, right? It's like, guys, you can't.
Well,
just...
I can tell you that was the reputation we got pretty early on, and we kept it for a long time. And it's one of the reasons that I was able to impress Rob Liefeld, and it's the reason everything else happened after that, was that we could sell more books of a particular subject than anybody else could with the same material.
Yeah, and
because we knew what we were doing, and we knew how to follow it up, and we knew how to put it together, and we knew how to encourage people, we knew how to reach out to the right people, and all that stuff. So, have you ever looked at old Marvel comics from like the late '60s and early '70s? At the bottom of the page, there'll be type, just a line of type that's promoting one of their other titles. Oh my God, when I was a Marvel reader, I loved that stuff. Like, I didn't ever buy a Two Gun Kid comic probably my whole life, but I knew a little bit of what was going on in the story because there was a little line of copy, like at the bottom of my Captain America comic, that said Two Gun Kid takes on, the Night Prowler in Two Gun Kid #4. I'm like, oh, but there's all sorts of really great cross promotional stuff that Marvel did that they sort of stopped doing over time.
As they stopped caring about their titles and they stopped being less intelligent and they started spreading themselves too thin. And that's something that I did not see you guys ever do, no matter how big you got. And I always respected that because it wasn't just random like, hey, Prime's our new big guy, so we're gonna push Prime in every single book we've got for the next 15 months and beat these kids, half of which are going to read Prime because he sounds interesting and that first ad is going to get them, and the rest could not care less because you're never going to hook them. So those ads just became repetitive and annoying in comic books, and I learned about comic books from comic book ads as a kid. Like you said, you used to have the little, the little readers down at the bottoms, and it was like, that month, you knew Two Gun Kid was going to be running into, like, say, the Rawhide Kid. And
right.
And you're like, oh, well, I read Rawhide Kid, so I need to go and check this out. Or, like, Man Thing's going to be over here doing this. And then they had the, the little bubbles that would say, remember back in issue da-da-da? And I was like, I would know to go and find Fantastic Four issue 48 because Galactus first showed up there. Pre the internet, this stuff was not shit that you saw. It was not widely available information, and people don't. I think when they're reading these comics now, it's a lot harder to understand the level of forethought and intelligence that made Malibu stand out heads and tails above the competition.
Well, it's just doing the little stuff. First of all, we never gave up on the premise of keeping our promises. So even if we took on a creator-owned book, or we took on a book that we knew wasn't going to sell very many copies, we didn't necessarily pay a big advance up front. We would have a generous royalty. If the thing took off, boy, you were going to get a lot more money, but we didn't want to be in the red publishing stuff, especially we weren't going to own it. So the important thing was to make small promises and then keep them. So we didn't overpromise, and we were able to keep our promises. And if we said we were going to send you $120, we sent you $120. And there's lots of examples all throughout comics of hucksters and incompetent people and all sorts of things screwing over creators. And at least when you came to Malibu, you got the straight story. Yeah,
and creator rights was going to be actually the next thing that I really got into, because during the late 80s, the early 90s, you had Dave Sim, Eastman and Laird with the creators' rights, and I don't think many people remember the Bill of Creators' Rights today. And it's a lot of historians like to talk about it like, oh, it's not important. And they just no, it was very important. And it brought, along with the return of Kirby and Neil Adams' original artwork through the Comics Journal Crusade and guys like Groth, bringing these injustices that you saw happening for 50, 60 years throughout the comic industry at that point to the public, eye for the first time. And Malibu became really well known for being very respectful of creators, very allowing of whatever amount of creative control you could allow. And I was wondering if that was your own prerogative, or if that was more of a thing that you and Scott and everybody else set out with to do with the company, or how that kind of came about.
Well, in the interest of like being fair and being upfront, we understood that if we brought on we could publish a creator-owned property without putting forward a lot of money, because we weren't taking it from them. We were sharing it with them. We were providing a service, right? So if you wanted to publish that same property in a situation where you were going to own it, you were going to be morally duty bound to pay a lot more up front, right? We didn't have the money to pay up front. That's why Malibu owning the Ultraverse happened so much later in our existence. We owned it, but we also sort of paid for the privilege, right? So as a small company, it's more an economic thing of giving up those rights, because you can publish more stuff and get going more if you are not hanging on to everybody's rights. And it's just an unnecessary level of contention that goes on between publishers and the talent. And I always loved talent. I mean, I always loved them. And I didn't want to be the guy that they were at odds with. Like, you have a thing, I'll make you an offer. If the offer's not good enough, we'll go our separate ways. Maybe we'll be able to come back together on something else. I didn't want to be that. I didn't want to be that guy, but we could make better deals, and we could provide a service. And because we knew what we were, like we were talking about, we knew what we do on the marketing and publishing side. We built up that level of credibility, so we could make those deals for less money, because they knew that if somebody promised them $500, there's a good chance they wouldn't get it. But if Dave promised you $250, you were going to get the $250. Does that make sense?
No, it absolutely does. And I just kind of wanted to get that, because I think that very much played into. I'll say I read an interview with you where you were talking about after you guys came together with Acme Interactive, and how Brett Blevins had to be paid simply because for the Prime video game, simply because he had come up with the original design for Prime, despite the fact he had literally never drawn Prime. Like,
right.
Leonardi and a couple other guys were, that was Prime. Even to this day, that's who people would think of as Prime. And I was like, Brett Blevins designed Prime? I didn't know this, and it is amazing that he got a check for that video game. And even when you're talking about, hey, we own the Ultraverse later, even at that point, you guys were treating your employees better with their royalties during your imprint own years than most people were treating guys in the independent world at that point. And I think that played a very large part in the next thing that I want to talk about, which is the little conversation that you had with Rob Liefeld. So how did you know Rob to begin with?
Well, I don't know if it was the first time I met Rob. Some of this is lost to history, but sometime in early '87, So we'd already set up, Tom and I were already working in the first Malibu office, which was about, I think, 300 square feet. It was tiny. When we were working in that very first office, it was just Tom and I, I remember Tom and I going through a package of a submission from Rob Liefeld. So, like I said, I don't know if I knew him and had a conversation with him first or whether he just sent it. Either way, we were a new publisher setting up shop. People were going to send us stuff. And in that package was the first picture of the Youngblood team. And I believe, I could be wrong, but I believe the shot that I got was Rob pencils, but Jerry Ordway inks. For some reason, Rob got Jerry Ordway to ink that pinup of the group shot of all the Youngblood characters. And that would have been 1987. And we tried to make a deal for Youngblood, and just about the time something might have happened, Rob was busy. I mean, Rob's always been a whirling dervish of activity, some of it sometimes not so productive, but he's always active. We were trying to make a deal to publish Youngblood and try to figure out when he could actually work on it and when he could produce it and when we could schedule it. And so that's the other thing that most people don't understand is you have to solicit 4 months in advance. So a lot of times, especially in those days, you wanted to have the entire first issue in the can 4 months ahead of time before you even solicited it. That way, if the book got behind schedule, at least you could get the first 3 or 4 issues out without ruining a monthly schedule. Anyway, so we're trying to work out how quickly Rob can produce these pages and whether we can have a thing. And then he got the, whatever it is, I think the Hawk and Dove job.
Yep.
So after that, Tom would like, you know what would really help us sell that create our own thing we're doing or whatever. Let's put a Rob Liefeld cover on it. So we call up Rob and Rob would do a cover for us for, $100, $150, whatever it was. So we were doing business with him. He was putting guest covers on, and Rob Liefeld guest covers did very well. They did very well. So most of the guys that we were working with at the time didn't complain if Rob was brought in to do a cover on one of their issues in their series. And so that's how it started. We were just offering him basically piece work in between what he was doing for Marvel or DC.
Yeah, and that was the one thing I'd never been able to find out was how you guys had originally hooked up. Like if he had tracked you down because of your reputation, or because he had been working for a Megaton before that, just prior, and really cutting his teeth, and he did have some pretty good inlets into the underground scene. So that's cool. That's interesting to know that he just kind of sent in submissions.
I think so. I think that's what all those guys were doing. Certainly Todd talks about sending 8 million things in and getting 8 million rejections. And Malibu was the first company to offer Jim Lee a contract to draw comics.
Really?
But before he could sign it, he got one of his jobs at either Marvel or DC. I don't remember what his first job was. I think it was a Marvel job.
It was. That's interesting.
So I think all of these aspiring artists would go through the buyer's guide or whatever source they had and look at the list of publishers, and we all had our addresses there. So Tom would go to the PO box every couple of days and bring back stacks of stuff. We had a form letter we'd send back and say, either we like your stuff or we can't do this book now, or let's talk some more or whatever. And he'd just mail them back out again.
Okay. That's insane. You don't remember what Lee was going to work on, do you?
No, it never got that far.
I didn't think so. I was like, wow, that's incredible. So that's like, because Larsen.
Actually, if we made him an offer, it hadn't gotten that far, but I don't remember any of the details. No,
I wouldn't expect you to so many years later. That's just nuts.
Yeah, it's great. It's a long, long time ago.
Well, and Lee was one of the guys who, he would become kind of the forefront of all of those guys. I think he's probably historically going to be known as the most competent and most foot forward artist from the entire Image line, but people don't remember his steam picked up much more slowly than Liefeld and McFarlane, because Liefeld came into Marvel, and as soon as he hit Marvel, it was a matter of months before, New Mutants went from being kind of like a niche direct market to like, okay, we got to get this guy on a real book,
Right.
and get him out there. So Liefeld, for anybody who has not seen my other episode, which Dave and I have both alluded to throughout this, the band comic that started Image, Liefeld went to release a creator-owned property, which, for lack of a better term, is simply nothing but a ripoff of the X-Men. It's called The Executioners, and he solicited it, and Marvel Legal called him up and told him that he was either not going to put out the book or he was not going to work for Marvel anymore. And that was the end of it. And Rob is a guy who is very fashionable to bash on now, because he has a big personality and he says whatever the heck is on his mind. And sometimes I don't always agree with that. But one thing,
he's made a bunch of shitty mistakes.
Well, he has, but I think it's.
I mean, not that we all haven't, but for some reason, Rob's mistakes seem to hang around his neck like an albatross a lot longer than the rest of us.
Because I think Rob isn't afraid to own them. Because
maybe.
I think
you
Rob,
might be right about that.
I think a lot of the stuff that a lot of guys in the industry do that get them in trouble is because they're trying to pander to whatever's popular, or they're trying to say something that's popular or make friends. And so 5-10 years down the line, you're like, nah, I was full of crap on that. I probably shouldn't have said that. Rob Liefeld don't give no fucks. He's like, oh yeah, when I was working for DC and I told DC that I knew they were going to close, that was right, because that's what I think. I'm Rob Liefeld. Deal with it. Like, okay, Rob, like it's half of the time I'm sticking up for the guy and defending him, and the other half of the time I'm commiserating with people like, yeah, I don't understand Rob either, guys. I'm sorry. But two things about him, undeniable, completely unarguable. He loves comic books.
Yeah.
And that motherfucker has got drive. I mean, drive and energy out the yin yang. You might not always put it in the right places, but can you talk about when, because you, Jim Valentino, and Erik Larsen, if I'm not mistaken, all sat down and had a conversation, I think at a dinner during a comic convention, that led to Larsen, or that led to Liefeld basically birthing Image in his mind. And in every interview and article and everything that I've ever read, it always has the same narrative of him being like, well, hey, Dave, what would you think about putting out a Rob Liefeld book? You're like, well, of course we would put out a Rob Liefeld book. We do that. What about Jim? I'd put out a Jim book. Everybody likes Valentino. What about Larsen? But you kind of being almost, it's, people like to play it up historically as you being unaware of what Liefeld was playing at. How much truth is there to that? Did you know that he was seriously considering abandoning work for Marvel at that point, or how did that conversation go?
Well, I'm going to try to make an apology for myself in terms of the legend of that, which is, I talked to a lot of creators who made a lot of noise that weren't any of those three guys. I mean, I've talked to a lot of different guys that had basically the same story. I've got my own creator-owned thing. I'd want to produce it. Would you produce it? Sure. And then nothing comes of it because there was no money in it, right? Like, I would have to pay them what I thought I could make based on the sales, and there was a long history of exactly what happens when a Marvel or DC guy left Marvel or DC and went to work on their own thing, and sales were generally a lot less, right? And it's not the first time. I mean, Chaykin did it, and Gil Kane did it, and I mean, lots of guys have gone and left Marvel and produced their own product, and there were lots of guys at the forefront of creator-owned comics. I mean, Mike Friedrich and Dean Mullaney and the Shanis brothers, all those guys were publishing houses that gave their creators the rights to their stuff. So there was a long history, long before Image, of there being creator-owned comics, and doing it. The only real difference with Image was that it happened all at once. It happened as a giant press release, and it was the top selling guys at the time, and they were hanging together. Usually when a guy left to do his own thing, he left to do his own thing, right? He didn't go, I'm going to do a thing, but it's going to be with 7 of my friends. That's really the only difference with Image. I mean, Image is really a glorified vanity press, right? Because they don't own anything. They only provide publishing services and share the profits. I mean, you can find, if you go to any publishing, resources, you can find people that will print your book for you for a price. So Image is not significantly different than that, in most cases. So that dinner, there was no way to tell that they were serious or more serious or less serious than the other creators I had talked to. And there was no way to tell that they were more or less serious than when they talked to me in 87, or when they talked to me in 88, or when they talked to me in 89. It's like a movie studio going, yeah, I might want to make a movie out of that. 9 times out of 10, it turns into nothing, and they were just diddling me. So the reason I didn't take it seriously is because it was just talk. When they decided to go from talk to reality, me and Tom and Chris were on a plane.
I was going to say, I remember reading about that, where it was like, instantly you guys were on a plane to go down and meet them and have serious talks with them. So what was the extent of the conversation that was actually had? Because as you said, there is this monumental legend, and at the time, I agree, Image was very much just like a vanity project, not even just a vanity publisher, but just a vanity project. It is these guys were like, we're really good artists. I don't think any of us can write, but we're really good at drawing stuff. So let's go and do books that look really good on our own and get somebody to do that. And you were that guy. But I'm curious what that conversation was, that in between there that led you to believe that they were serious. Was there like a certain point where just Rob called you up and was like, we're leaving, this is when it's happening? Or
when Executioners happened, right, Rob was making all sorts of noise independently about wanting to do his own stuff and have control of his own stuff. And don't misunderstand for a second, God bless him. If you can take control of everything about your life and create your own little cottage industry and make money and support yourself and have employees, great, beautiful. I'm totally sympathetic. Go with my blessing and God bless. But when Executioners happened, Rob was already having a bunch of discussions, and one of those discussions was with me about publishing a book we were going to call Extreme, The Art of Rob Liefeld. Now, what sometimes gets lost is I came up with the name Extreme for the name of The Art of Rob Liefeld. Like, what are we going to call the Art of Rob Liefeld book? Well, that's The Art of Rob Liefeld's really boring. Let's call it Extreme. It's got X in it. Ooh, we love stuff that have X's in it. I mean, it was that time of in the industry when everybody loved having an X and stuff. So we were going to do an Art of Rob Liefeld book, and so we were trying to figure out how much Marvel art we could put in it without getting into trouble, how much DC art we could put in it without getting into trouble, and how much we could pad with the interview and all that stuff. I've got an entire layout for the Extreme the Art of Rob Liefeld book here somewhere.
Oh, that's
I was
so
thinking
cool.
I was thinking about selling it on eBay. We had the entire thing laid out, ready to go. It just didn't have the illustrations in it.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So we were already talking about doing stuff with Rob, right? So we were discussing this Art of Rob Liefeld project that was ongoing, but we hadn't talked about it publicly because it wasn't time. That was the other thing. One of the things Malibu was great about was having the discipline to not talk about stuff so that when you announced it to get the retailers excited for their orders, it was still a big deal. It wasn't already old hat by the time the retailers were ordering it. So you had to keep your big mouth trap shut about stuff you were working on. So we're working with Rob, working with his friend Hank Canals, we're working with Rob. And so it took a bunch of turns, and Rob's always got a million ideas. So it morphed and changed and got weird, and we did all this stuff, right? And then that would have been the fall, and that would have been the fall of 92, the fall of 91. I'm not sure what the dates are. But do you know which December it was that they had the auction in New York and Todd cornered
91.
Silvestri? That was 91. So it was the fall of 91. So we're having all these talks with Rob because he wants to branch out from Marvel and own his own stuff, and he's got aspirations. He's an ambitious dude, right? So we're having talks with Rob, and then in these conversations, have you ever talked to Rob? No. Okay. All of his conversations are like this. Like he's all over the place, right? So during these conversations, he's talking about how he's talking to Todd, and Todd's unhappy, and Todd's hockey cards aren't taken off the way he thought, and Erik's unhappy, and Jim's trying to keep me on the straight and narrow, and he's talking about all this stuff, right? Well, talking to Rob, and he's saying, yeah, we're starting to think about maybe doing something together, but we don't know what it's going to be or what the shape of it's going to be or whatever. And then I get this call, he goes, and I would always say, whatever you're going to do, please keep me in the loop. I would like to at least have a chance to participate. Like I'd like the chance to help you. And we get this call in December, and he says, if you want to be involved, you have to be in New York on this date. Okay. So Tom and Chris and I went to our travel agent and booked the flights, and we all flew to New York, and we met with them at breakfast. And they said, we're going to go talk to Marvel in DC and tell them what's up, but we're out of there. And that was it. So they had breakfast. They came back, and they had the war story about having talked to Marvel and talked to DC or whatever. And so I was like, okay, well, what's next? I'm just sitting there watching it. I'm like a spectator. And I said, well, kind of what's next? And he said, well, Todd was running the show at this point. And he said, go upstairs, come up with a publishing proposal, and come back down in the morning, and we'll talk about it. I don't think Tom and Chris and I slept more than an hour and a half.
Oh my God. That's crazy. Overnight they expected that? Wow. Oh, Todd, you crazy, crazy man. So,
well, here's the punchline. They didn't apparently sleep much that night either. They came down to breakfast the next morning, and they weren't interested in anything we had to say.
What?
They just dictated terms. Here's what the deal is going to be. You're going to get this. You're going to do this. You're going to do that. That's it. That's the deal. If you want it, take it. It was basically a take it or leave it deal for us, for Malibu.
Okay, and that was something I was going to ask, because there's a few things that are always put. This narrative changes. Image is legendary at this point. So little bits of the narrative change, but there are like little bits that are usually the same. One of the things that I have never been able to pinpoint, because people just don't talk about it. When did the spearhead, like the guy who was at the forefront of the pack, which was Rob Liefeld, came up with the idea, had the initial conversations with you, made the initial contact, came up with the initial ideas, initially recruited people. McFarlane was not even one of these original guys. He'd been sitting around the Marvel office whining and complaining for several years about his mistreatment, and he'd even left comics, or was saying he was going to leave comics or whatever.
He was completely out.
Yeah, I was going to say, because
he'd worked for months and months and months developing this. He was gonna be a trading card guy. He was developing his own line of hockey cards. So he knew he couldn't get baseball, but he knew if he could get a line of hockey cards, then he would be able to get in the door to make baseball cards.
See, and everybody likes to paint Image Comics as Todd McFarlane. Like, Image is Spawn, Spawn is Todd McFarlane, and that's just...
If you want to know when Todd took over the entire narrative, I couldn't tell you, but it happened sometime before we had breakfast with them that morning in New York in December.
Well, see, you're the closest guy that I've ever talked to this entire situation, and just from like what you're saying, it sounds like at some point after Liefeld had that conversation with you, which was much more like out there of like, hey, would you do this? And you were like, yeah, I would do it, half taking him seriously because it's Rob and he's bouncing all over the place. But
it's not just Rob, it's like that happened with hundreds, not hundreds, but dozens and dozens of other creators I had the same conversation with. And a lot of those didn't come to anything.
But what I meant is that if you had somebody more concrete, like, Jim Valentino or something like that, and you couldn't take them seriously, then Rob Liefeld, who's, as you said,
right.
kind of like all over and bouncing all over the
fair
place.
enough.
Like,
I hear you.
How do I take this as seriously? But then things got really serious, really quick for everybody inside of Image. And I think from the way that I understand things, I think Todd McFarlane really got pissed off with that the meeting they had around the Sotheby's auction with Marvel, where they kind of were like, look, you guys, we should probably be getting more money and we want a little bit of more marketing.
He was already done before then.
Well, no, but what I'm saying is that's when he moved to the forefront of like, okay, everybody else is pussyfooting around. My wife is here. Jim Lee's family is here. This is right around Christmas, and I am not fucking with this anymore. This is going to happen or it's not going to happen. And then from that point on, it was Todd doing the talking.
Yeah. Well, and Jim wasn't even in officially for a really long time.
Yeah.
A stunningly long time. A long time that people don't remember.
And they don't like to talk about, and Image likes to...
Silvestri was in long before Jim Lee was in.
From what I can understand, the story that you hear about Lee at the Sotheby's auction is much more real about Silvestri at the Sotheby's auction than Jim Lee. From what I understand, they ran into Silvestri, and Silvestri was like, that night was like, yeah, no. And Lee got really upset, I think, that his art sold for so much, but it still took him a long time him and Waltz Portacio, actually.
Waltz never really pulled the trigger. He kind of said, yeah, and then it wasn't even a month later, he kind of went, nah.
Oh, I was going to say, because from everything that I understood, it was like family, his...
He did have family stuff, and he was flying back and forth to the Philippines, and all that stuff is true as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm sorry, that kind of got derailed a little bit there.
No, I think it's important for you to get that stuff straight in your head.
And that's one of the big reasons that I wanted to have this conversation with you, is because Image is important. And I think a lot of the narrative gets lost in these big legendary stories about egos like McFarlane and Liefeld, which I honestly just couldn't care less about their egos. They're extremely important in comics. I have had to learn to
it's hard to argue with their accomplishments.
It is, and I've had to work very difficult. It's been very hard to learn to set aside some people's personalities that I've had shoved in my face for 20 or 30 years and accept that they are important human beings and that I will never fully understand who they are or their motivations behind this stuff.
Sure.
Which is why I kind of get a little bit upset with everybody bashing on Rob. Like, if you come at me with a few things about Rob, yeah, he's done some really dumb stuff and said some really not cool stuff. But that's never the stuff anybody brings up. They're just like feet and blah, blah, blah. Shut up. Everybody steals. Everybody does homages. So, Malibu, how involved were you? You said something that interested me. When Liefeld and all of these guys were just starting off, they had no idea how to do anything. For anybody watching this who doesn't know, they like to, I say they, Todd McFarlane likes to sweep Jim Valentino under the rug. He doesn't like the fact that Valentino was involved. He was considered the uncool old guy in the room. Todd McFarlane didn't like his work, didn't like his writing, didn't like the guy. Valentino was the only guy who knew how to put out a dang comic book, though. He'd been involved with everything. He knew how to put it together, how to format stuff, and he's the guy who taught Liefeld how to do all of this, and that's how their relationship evolved. But I didn't know
they shared a studio, yeah.
Yeah, but one of the big reasons for that when I was looking into like why they had shared a studio is because Liefeld attached to him like a remore, on the bottom of a shark and was like, dude, you can do everything. You can put out a comic book because Valentino literally could. He could put
he had in the past, yeah.
Exactly. He had done it. He was the only guy. And you said something, you said you wanted to help them. Please let me help you however I can. And I was curious how involved or uninvolved you and Malibu were, because in a lot of times I hear you guys kind of just written off as like the face, just the image for guys like, okay, send us your pages. We'll make sure that the comic makes it out on this and such date.
It's kind of hard to answer that because it was very clear from the very beginning that if Image, well, first of all, they didn't know what they were doing, which is true. They knew how to write and draw comics, and they knew people that knew how to get the pages to the printer. But they were really learning on the fly. You're sitting alone drawing comics and sending them into Marvel and DC. You don't learn a lot about what happens after that, right? So we helped them with the initial solicitation stuff. We did all that stuff. And so it was always a fight to get them to give us the information we needed. But mostly it was really clear that they didn't want any of the headlines overflowing onto Malibu. They didn't want Malibu to get even 1% of the credit for anything they did. So it was very much, in my mind, it was very much a reaction, like an overreaction to what they were rebelling against, right? So they just came out of a situation, and they wanted to prove that they were the boss. They hadn't just signed up with a new boss, right? The problem was that they didn't know how to do any of the things they needed to do, and they'd already announced, right? So now all this stuff needs to get done, and they don't know what they're doing, and so we were there to help them do it, but we were always not literally, but figuratively getting the back of their hand. Every tiny bit of respect or recognition that came as part of the process, we were constantly getting the back of their hand, because we were just the guys. We were just the suits that were getting in the way, right? We weren't super valuable creative people. So things would happen like, as soon as the news broke, our phones at Malibu Comics lit up like a Christmas tree. Everybody in the world wanted to talk to the publisher of the new 7 renegade artists. And you couldn't tell them because they didn't understand the concept, because it wasn't communicated well, which we could have helped with, but they didn't ask us. The news media did not understand the concept of, oh no, these 7 guys, they're just calling themselves something. Those are actually 7 completely different separate entities, 7 completely separate companies, basically sticking themselves under an umbrella, and the umbrella's not Malibu. And they were like, well, who's their spokesperson? They don't have a spokesperson. So on my blog, which I've never updated anymore, I told the story about how one of the very intrepid people who were chasing down the story said, I understand that Jack Kirby lives in Southern California. Do you think he'd be willing to talk to me about what these artists are doing? And I said, I know Jack. I can call him and ask him if you'd like, because I can't. I was literally under a gag order. If anybody called about Image, I couldn't say a thing, not a peep, not a word, because the Image guys knew that the news media would quote me, and they didn't want me quoted on anything that had to do with Image. Now, I understand, but logistically that causes a bunch of problems, right? So I called Jack, and Jack said, yeah, tell the reporter they can come to my house because I'd like to say something about this, but I'll only do it if you come. So me and the TV reporters caravan to Jack's house, and he said how much he supported the creator, the creators doing their creator own thing, and they're, God bless them, go with God, and take control of your, take control of your life, take control of your career, blah, 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 blah. But it was really great. And then I got to hang out with Jack Kirby some more. So that was very cool. And then after the reporter left, Roz kind of tugged on my shirt a little bit and said, can you hang out? Sure. So I sat at their kitchen table. We had cookies and lemonade, and they were all over every detail of this story. They didn't let on really so much to the reporters. They just covered like the big picture stuff. But once the reporters were gone, they wanted to know all the details they weren't getting from the news media. It was great. It was a good day.
That's really awesome. Because for anybody who doesn't know, one of the last things that Kirby was involved with was the 1962 series from Image, which was really supposed to pay homage to, and it is a travesty against humanity that they could not get their crap together enough to finish that series. It will forever remain one of the greatest unfinished projects in history. But at one point, and this is no exaggeration, at one point the guys who ran Image loved Kirby so much, he was supposed to be in every one of their books. He was supposed to be
that doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, he was supposed to be the Image banner, not the Image eye. It was going to be like, it wasn't going to be called Kirby Comics, but it was going to be Kirby Comics.
Yeah.
And it's super cool to hear a story about how so early on Kirby was interested in that, because he had done like Captain Victory, and he talked about, how this stuff had happened before with guys big guys leaving the industry to do their own stuff. Captain Victory and I think that was with who was Neil
Pacific.
Adams. Oh, was it Pacific?
Pacific did Captain Victory, but Neil Adams had a lot of creator-owned stuff that he did.
I was going to say
through Continuity Associates, yeah.
Continuity was it? Yeah, that's what I was trying to think of. Yeah, was Neil Adams, because he's the one. Oh, he's just the one who set up the deal for Captain Victory. That's what it was. But
possibly, yeah.
Well, yeah, I just read it. I just read an interview in Comic Scene. I read a bunch of old magazines for the website or for the YouTube channel, and that was one of the interesting things that I learned. But it's cool to know that Jack was so interested in that, because he'd been involved, and I think he really was one of the few people who could see that might be where the industry needed to head after all the problems he'd had with Marvel and DC, to put it lightly. So you're basically like gagged by Image, and I totally get this from both sides, because you don't want somebody taking credit for the stuff you're doing, but also they didn't
want to trade in a new daddy for an old daddy for a new daddy.
Yeah, but it also plays into the major problem that I have with essentially all of the Image founding fathers, with the exception of Jim Lee, who seems like he did a lot better job of handling it. But
No, that's not true at all.
no, handling certain aspects of it. Lee seems like he very much was unhappy from day one and didn't really like what he was doing, so he threw himself more into the business aspect of stuff. And I don't hear stories about Lee not paying people like I do with Liefeld or McFarlane. There's no lawsuits with him where he stole characters like McFarlane stole characters. There's some pretty big differences, I think, with how Lee handled things, and he came at things a lot more from the outside. Always, I think.
The one that always impressed me the most was Erik Larsen. He's been the most consistent in terms of taking the opportunity and sticking to what he thought the original opportunity was. Now, I'm not saying you have to do that, but Erik always just like, yeah, I want control of making my own comic, and I don't want to have to depend on anybody else. That's it. That's the whole thing.
But he's also never turned around and been the same guy, because a lot of the guys who came from Marvel ended up doing the same thing that had ticked them off at Marvel and DC to guys
Right.
like you, their employees. That's more what I meant. And Lee seems to have been much less susceptible to that, is what
Right.
I'm
Well, I don't know. I don't know how true that is. But I do know that eventually, well, two things happen. One, from my point of view, eventually the Image deal didn't turn out to be revolutionary for comics because the guys ended up doing exactly to their talent what had been done to them, right? So it wasn't ultimately that they had a problem with that they thought they could reinvent the process. They were just angry who was in charge of the process.
Who was making the money more than anything else, getting the credit, taking the money. And that goes right back into like you saying, like, I was under this guy, I was not allowed to say anything. And that plays very much into because I wasn't sure how true or untrue that narrative is with how legendary and blown out of proportion a lot of this stuff gets. The comic industry at this point in 93 is like a $1 billion industry. It's fairly big.
Yeah.
And
it's generated a lot of money.
Yeah, and
a lot of money on unsold copies. That's the problem, but a lot of money. Yeah.
And Malibu ended up with, I think, just short of or just over 10% of the market and knocked DC out of second place while you guys were with Image. I don't know the details of the the deal that you made with Image as far as like what was trickling back monetarily or just exposure wise, because as you said, a lot of people were just confused and they tied Image and Malibu together in a lot of ways. Was there a lot of influx of like money and attention that happened at that point?
Sure. Well, mostly by people who misunderstood the deal.
Well,
right.
and that's
in terms of attention, but there was so much money. I mean, a factor of probably 8, maybe 6 to 8 times more money than we thought was going to be flowing through the process. And so our cut ended up being pretty substantial, even though the percentage was small because you're working with giant numbers. The actual amount of income turned out pretty good. Yep.
Did that what did you guys do with that? Was it a good thing for Malibu, or was it difficult for you all to deal with and adjust, considering you did not see this coming and it had to have been a massive influx?
Yeah, well, we had to move some assets around, but you got to understand, we'd been producing 30 books a month for 3 years before Image came along. That's a pretty good, that's a pretty good chunk of change. And it wasn't a lot of money, but we were doing the work. So adding 10 more books, we just cut $10 off the bottom that weren't selling very well, and we had the labor and resources to take care of Image.
Okay. And what did you guys do? But my question was when that all started coming in, was it a positive thing? Did you guys use that as a way to kind of bolster and work on Malibu? Or
sure, yeah. Well, we used it to invest in equipment and pay off bills and hire a little bit of help and that kind of thing. But most importantly, we went into panic mode because we knew it wasn't going to last. Like, it became clear very shortly it wasn't going to last. And the publishing business works many, many months in advance. So by the time we're 2 months in to the Image deal, we don't know when it's going to die, but it's going to die at some point soon. We have to figure out what that next thing is for us. And that was the Ultraverse.
Okay. So the influx of money, you said you were aware that wasn't going to last. Was that just basically because of the impression you'd got from everybody who was like, don't talk about this, you guys are the front, we're going to dictate what's happening, and you kind of just saw it coming?
Well, they resented us from day one.
Okay.
And they were starting to staff up, so the writing was on the wall, and rightfully so. I mean, it was the natural progression. So we started trying to figure out what the next phase of Malibu's life was going to be like, pretty early on.
So let's talk about the Ultraverse, because that's, I think most people who are watching this are probably most interested in the Ultraverse. It's probably most of what they read from you guys in a lot of cases.
Yeah, a lot of people think I was born in 1992. Yeah.
I'm going to tell you what, when I was growing up, I thought that you were more my age. And when I got older, the more comics I started reading, I was like, wow, his name actually goes back. It was really interesting to find out how much history you have with the medium. Yeah. This idea of the Ultraverse, which is a shared universe of collected characters that all have a very tightly knit continuity, which kind of falls back on that the original Marvel idea of like, the FF being in New York and everything kind of interacting. But that got to be a real big millstone around the neck of mainstream continuity comics during the 90s. And it was something that had been kind of, I don't want to say abandoned, but the industry had been running from it since the 80s with stuff like Crisis on Infinite Earths, where DC was quite obviously admitting, like, we do not know what the heck to do with 60 years of back history.
How can we make the DC universe more like the Marvel universe? The unfortunate, it was really like a white flag, right? It was like a flag of surrender at some level.
And then when Marvel started saying the same thing in the early 90s, like, oh no, Peter Parker's a clone, and that's why he's been acting weird and married Mary Jane. And here's this clone, and he's the real Spider-Man. Wait, what? Look over there. DC broke Batman's back. Aren't you mad about that? That was the kind of stuff that we were seeing in the industry at the time. And Malibu came in with Valiant and Malibu both came in with something of a fresh take and perspective on things. And Valiant was run by Shooter, who was very much like story. Art shouldn't matter for crap. And that is in my opinion, short-sighted and stupid opinion to have in a medium that is half reliant on visual aspects. Malibu, very much to me, especially now as a older person who can read it and isn't distracted by like,
yeah, old geezer, thanks for the praise.
Well, you know what I'm saying? Like,
I do. I'm teasing you.
Yeah, I can look back now and I'm not so much distracted by like, look at the art on Prime or look at the story on Prime. I can see them as a cohesive, interactive thing, which is extremely cool because most books at this point did not work like that. Even Valiant, which is the one other outsider publisher making any headway, was hanging their hat on story alone. Can you talk a little bit about the approach that you guys took to the Ultraverse, and was the Ultraverse in fact a like reaction to Image, or was that something that you guys had kind of had in mind and thinking of prior to Image happening?
There was a level of it that I'm sure looks like a reaction to Image, and probably we fostered that image, that impression. I don't know if in our minds it was that so much, but we definitely did it for promotional purposes. Because if you look at all the early promotion, we feature the art, but the list is the founding fathers, right? It's all writers, right? So that was trying to differentiate, right, the Ultraverse from some of the other stuff that was going on with the art, the popular artist thing. In terms of internally, we basically were looking at the fact that our company had almost zero value. We'd been doing it for, well, 87 to 93. We've been doing it for 7 years, right? And we basically had a company that had almost no value. We were renting our facility. We had some computers and some desks, which don't amount to anything. But the company didn't actually own any IP. We had a slice of interest in this IP or that IP, and we had a bunch of licensed property. We didn't own that either. So if a banker or anybody else came to value the company, and I owned a small piece of the company, they came to value the company, they would go, you can't get a loan because you've got almost no value. You don't own anything.
Okay.
So one of the things we wanted to do was give us something to own. And so then the question is, how do we do that and not betray our original intent and a lot of our original desires to always keep our promises and to treat the creators, in a way that's dignified and all of that, right? So Chris Ulm came up with this proposal for a creator or for a company-owned universe, which we called Megaverse. And we worked on it, and then we just kept adding on aspects based on all of our experience, Tom's experience and mine and Scott's, and trying to figure out ways to make as big a launch as possible. So that's why we set up the contracts the way we did, which was founding fathers get a tiny slice, the guys who design the characters get a tiny slice, the writers get a bigger slice. So it was really a matter of figuring out how much of the income from non-publishing that we wanted to share, and what was the fair number to use. So that was a lot of it. And after that, it was mostly just about how do we put this project together in a way that can sell the most books, because that's our job, right? The more books we sell, the more we can pay the talent, the more we can potentially, I could, buy another pair of shoes or something, whatever. So that was, did that answer your question?
Absolutely, it did. When I was growing up, and it is extraordinarily embarrassing to admit, as much as I've learned now, but at the time, a lot of my exposure basically came from Comic Scene and Wizard. And if you paid any attention to the way that things were worded, the way things were structured, it seemed like Malibu was knee-jerk reacting to Image leaving, and you guys were real butthurt, and then all of a sudden this weird half-cocked notion of the Ultraverse came along. But several months ago, I do these things called deep dives, where I take old Comic Scene magazines or whatever it is, and I'll look at the ads, everything, just rip them apart. Because you will find some great stuff in there. And one of the most interesting things I found was in Hero Illustrated. And Hero was kind of the outsider, on there. They weren't Comic Buyer's Guide. They weren't.
No, but they were Wizard was making so much money that Hero was supposed to be designed to be an answer for Wizard. And talk about people who have made a bunch of mistakes and rubbed a bunch of people the wrong way. Wizard certainly had that problem from the inside of the comics business. So a lot of us who were getting the backhand from Wizard were grateful to have Hero as an alternative, and Wizard desperately needed some competition.
They really did. And unfortunately, I lived in a small town, so I didn't have access to anything but like Wizard and sometimes comic scene.
Yep.
And when I went back and I did this deep dive on Hero Illustrated, when I heard them talk, they were much more level-handed when discussing stuff. And when I heard them describing both the World's Greatest Universe by Dark Horse, which was happening at the time.
Comics Greatest World, yeah.
Thank you. I can't tell I'm dyslexic at all, can you?
No, it's a terrible name.
It truly is.
We mocked it all the time.
It is absolutely awful. And like I'd seen it on so many comics, and when I read that article, I was like, holy crap, that's the name of an actual line and not just some weird slogan they put around their fucking logo at one point. Oh, Dark Horse, ye silly, silly people. But when they talked about your company, they were very level-headed, and they didn't, oh, this is the greatest thing since sliced bread. You should run out and buy 50 copies of issue 1 because it's going to put your kid through college, screw Spawn 1.
Yeah, right.
Because that's just all you read. And when I was reading about your company, this level of forethought and intelligence going into things where it felt like the only way that you were going to compete with somebody like Marvel was not by having better art, going to be by paying for necessarily even bigger names. It was by doing your job and doing it well. And Ultraverse, when I started going in and reading the titles, as I had more people popping up in the comments like, dude, have you even read these? Like you're making these funny offhanded jokes about these books. Have you read these books? Yeah, I read them. Oh wait, no, I guess I got the third issue of Hard Case, and I had read one issue of this and one issue of that, and I might have been a teenager at the time, and and I might have been going through this period where I was even crapping all over Spider-Man and Wolverine, the biggest. Prior to that, 5 years before that, it was only Spider-Man, Wolverine, and then I was like, screw all that. I want to read The Tick, man. I want to read Scud the Disposable Assassin.
Yeah.
And I just threw Malibu under the bus. And reading these articles from guys like Hero, who were more outside of the mainstream, looking in and able to analyze this stuff, I realized that Ultraverse was in no way a knee-jerk reaction and falls so far outside of that weird 90s clawing at the speculators market where Marvel is hiring, Jameis, who's the head of fucking Flair to do Marvel and stuff. You guys, no, I want to create a universe. I want to do something original. I think you saw the best in what was happening with everybody else around you. Can you talk a little bit about the meeting that you had? Because I didn't know. I was reading, or I think maybe I was listening to a podcast interview that you had done, and you talked about a meeting where you went in with basically everybody from Malibu, and you sat down and essentially gave birth to the Ultraverse.
Sure. Yep. Yeah. We, so Chris came up with this plan, and then the next piece of the plan was to figure out who we wanted to help us build the sandbox. Because the next job, because our philosophy was, if you look at Marvel and DC, they have great universes, but they were built piecemeal. So they were built like a 40-story building that only built one room at a time. And different people built the room, so it's all mismatched and all crazy, right? So we asked ourselves, okay, what would we do and could we make it better if we built the world first and then populated it with characters and then wrote stories about the characters in the world. You're still going to get a little bit of that as the stories are written, but at least you've got a framework for them to work in and around, and you're not creating something. You don't have to keep track of if something new is created. You have to keep track of it less. If something's created over here that then gets used over there, right? If some of that stuff is already built in, then we've already sort of agreed to it from the beginning, and you can get some advantages, hopefully, from having planned at least the beginning stages pretty well. So the first goal was to come up with a list of guys who we thought could help us do that. And so we just started batting around guys we thought were really creative, that we thought were up and comers, guys that we could get that weren't under exclusives. A lot of Marvel and DC guys were under exclusive contracts, so they couldn't participate even if they wanted to. We went and got some guys that we had a lot of respect for, that we knew were available, like Gerber, like Englehart. So we just got this group of guys together, and then we gave them all plane tickets, and we all flew to Scottsdale. One of the guys that got those plane tickets was a guy named Wes Craven, and Wes Craven was going to be at the first Ultraverse conference and help us build the Ultraverse. And right before, and he had his ticket in his hand, and we got a call from his assistant that one of his movies got greenlit and he wasn't going to be able to make it. But we did get Larry Niven. Larry Niven was helpful. So, but yeah, it would have been cool to hang out with Wes Craven for a weekend and create a comic book universe. That would have been cool.
Craven seems like he would have been a really. Did you ever get to talk to him or anything?
No, never did. Yeah, no. So yeah, we all went to Scottsdale. We sat in a hotel room for 2.5 days and came up with characters. I mean, me and Bob Jacob and Len Straczewski and Jerry Jones and maybe somebody else were in a break-off group to create Prime. And that was really exciting, just batting around ideas. It's like, all right, so we love Captain Marvel. We like Superman. How can we make it different, right? But still maintain what makes the character cool. Well, we like that a young boy can turn into a superhero. Okay, that's great. Well, in Captain Marvel's case, it was done with magic. Okay, so we'll do it with science. And then I was the one that came up with, wouldn't it be cool if the body he creates is from his imagination and then it just turns to goop?
Prime was one of the books when I went back and was reading. That book absolutely bowled me over. Just the premise for that, I was like, this is so absolutely drawing on everything that I love about Captain Marvel. And yes, it's Captain Marvel. Screw you, Shazam people.
No, but we clearly Prime is unabashedly a homage to Captain Marvel, no question. And yet, I think it's its own thing.
It really is. That's what I was going to say. Is it has a premise that is very much people have given a lot of intelligent thought to the premise of little boy superpowers, application of this, not necessarily in the sense of like Dark Knight, Watchmen, like real world, like, oh God, if he was that strong, he'd accidentally crush his mother's head, giving her a hug, and let's do a scene of her brains all over the wall. It was more addressed of like the scene that got me, where I was like, I remember I set the comic down and I was like, well, crap, this just cost me a lot of money. Because I'm going to have to go back and just bin dive, was when he dealt with the abusive coach.
Right.
And he messes him up, man.
Sure. Yeah.
And he messes him up in front of those girls that he's, assaulted. And I'm like, oh, okay, so now they're going to do the whole, like, these chicks are going to be, oh my God. And you're like, this is brilliant comic book writing, right? This is something original happening right now. This is not pandering to all of the stupid body and corpse crap that you're seeing. And series like Sludge.
I like how the fact that his crazy body is that way because it's what a 11-year-old boy would think a superhero would look like. So that's what he created.
And how everyone...
Right? So you can justify all of the screwed up anatomy and all that stuff, right? Because it's not real. It's Kevin's imagination.
And it freaks people out in that universe.
Right. Like, well, yeah, because it's fucking grotesque. Are you kidding me?
Well, when they see, and that's amazing because normally comics cannot take that level of meta approach to existence. The idea of like, okay, we're in a comic and everybody has to be okay with the idea of everybody being in spandex and having superpowers. So that means that everybody cannot be freaked out about anything, which is the most asinine. Like, way to cut yourself off from telling basically any good character-based storytelling plots, guys. Because if you can't have emotional reactions to anything, what are you doing? But at the heart of this, you guys had a creative team. And the creative team was most certainly comprised of people, Steve Gerber.
Yep.
I will forever regret the chance that I did not get to personally thank him for the impact that he's had on my life and my love of the medium. And he wasn't what I would consider to be like an inordinately superstar name, but he was definitely nobody small. And guys like Brett Blevins.
If you talk to guys my age, we all worship Gerber.
Hey man, people do not understand that like that Howard the Duck when he dropped in Journey into in Journey into Fear,
mystery or Adventures in Fear. Oh, what the hell was it called?
You know what I'm talking about.
Adventure into Fear. I think is what it was called.
Yeah, and then everybody's writing in and they're like, "We want more Howard the Duck," and that book spiked hard. People don't remember that. Now it's Steve Gerber just kind of gets written on. What about all his amazing work with Dr. Fate?
Yeah.
I mean, literally, like, dude, his stuff that he did with Dr. Fate was like revolutionary. People don't talk about that. But you guys had a core of guys that were like that. Extremely intelligent guys who were good at their jobs. How did you go about recruiting and building that talent?
Well, it was hard because we kind of had to know if they were going to say yes ahead of time. So we couldn't ask a lot of guys that were much of a risk because this is during the building process. So to get them to say yes, you kind of have to lay out what you're asking them to do, right? And if they say no, you can't really say you can't talk about that. I mean, you can, but what are you going to do if they do? Right? Okay. So you can't have a lot of guys running around that rejected you because that looks bad. Because those guys all talk to each other like, oh, these fucking idiots from Malibu called us and I'm not doing that shit. Right? And then suddenly there's a ball rolling and we can't get behind it. We're stuck in front of it. Right?
Yep.
So there's that aspect of it. There's another aspect of it was we had to find people who could play nice because we were all going to be founding fathers. And so there was going to things we were going to kind of have to do together or agree upon or show up and do promotion stuff together. And we kind of had to be the get along gang at least a little bit. And then they had to be guys that we knew that could do the work. And we wanted some name value if we could get it. So there was a lot of aspects in terms of deciding who was in and who was out.
How did you now, as I understand it, you were the guy who was basically responsible for recruiting most of those guys, right?
Me and Tom. Yeah, that's probably true. Yeah.
How did you go about that? Like,
I have almost no memory of it. I remember like I would call them up and say, we're doing this thing. First of all, are you available? I want to send you this thing. I want to know if you want to do it. If you want to do it, let's enter into a discussion about how, what your time availability is. And I mean, it was pretty standard stuff.
I just didn't know because you were talking about, you had to take a kind of trepidatious approach to speaking to people about it. So stuff didn't leak.
Yeah, but you could kind of, writers understand I've got this secret thing I can't talk to you about unless I know you're available. So let's talk about that first. And then the other thing is it's going to be a team thing. So are you willing? Like, do you really want to be sometimes it's nice to just sit at your typewriter or computer all day and not talk to anybody and just write cool stuff. If that's what you want to do, maybe this isn't for you. So there was ways to couch it without revealing the whole thing. but ultimately you had to reveal the whole thing before they could commit. So you had to sort of do it in pieces.
There's a couple of guys I want to ask you, just because you took such a hands-on approach to the company, and that is another thing in my research that I really do want to commend you about, because
Thank you.
I saw so many people get into the industry who I felt like really did love the industry, and then one or two things happen and they get frustrated, or they get burned, or they work with somebody that they like who it turns out they don't like so much anymore, and then they just kind of like crawl off into a corner and they leave stuff to other devices. I think that happened to McFarlane on Spawn, and it's the reason that I really applaud you bringing up Larsen, because I am constantly championing Larsen on this channel, and people do not, they just gloss over him. Like, the guy's been doing 250 issues of Savage Dragon, and McFarlane did what, 12 issues of Spawn? So
he's sitting at his desk creating comics. He's not chasing he's not chasing the headlines. And he doesn't see the value or need for it in most cases.
It doesn't make him happy.
He's getting what he wants.
Exactly. He loved comics.
I mean, Erik's a great guy, but he's not ambitious the way Todd or Jim or Rob were. That's all.
But I don't see that as a bad thing, as a comic.
No, I don't either. I'm just saying, I think it's one of the reasons that you and I might have an outsized respect for him compared to the other guys, is their ambitions made them harder to relate to.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to say, is because I really I love that you brought it up, because it does give me a kind of a chance to talk a little bit on the channel with people in a more open dialogue. I think I do see things a lot more, not to insinuate that I have any level of being a professional, but I think I look at things a lot more.
Not that being a professional is not really about that much different than not being a professional, frankly.
Well, no, but I think I analytically pull things apart. I see things a lot more like people who create comics as like separate entities, and then a whole, and like all these different moving parts. And I have enough knowledge of who these guys are and what was going on, and monetarily what was happening.
I like your ability to read between the lines. I think you've got a really good instinct for like the difference between the bullshit press release and what's probably happening behind. Tom and I call it reading the tea leaves. I think you're pretty good at reading tea leaves.
And that's what I mean, is kind of seeing,
if I had to guess.
Yeah, that's kind of what I see as an industry professional, because I see that as probably 80% of your job as a comic professional.
Yeah,
is like, how much of what is this guy telling me complete and utter bullshit, and what's the 10% that's half true, and the 10% that's actually going to happen and is the truth. So you recruited some of these guys like Steve Gerber.
Yep.
What was working with Steve like? I'm just inordinately curious about the guy.
All right. Let me preface all of this with my deep and abiding love for Steve Gerber. I think it was 4 years ago, it might have been 5 years ago, at the Eisner Awards, I was sitting next to his daughter, and I literally broke down into tears trying to tell her how much Steve meant to me. And it really bugged me that at the end of his life, I didn't get to Vegas to say goodbye. That bothers me a lot. I loved Steve. Now, Steve was about as quirky as they get. And one of the things that doesn't probably get enough attention is the fact that Steve had an undiagnosed physical problem that probably affected his writing in a seriously significant way. So we all benefited, but it sort of took it out of Steve, which is this. He had undiagnosed severe sleep apnea for approximately 35 years.
Oh my God.
So he didn't get a full night's sleep in 35 years. So if you're that sleep deprived and you're trying to write stuff, it kind of explains Howard the Duck and Void Indigo and a whole lot of other things that were going on with Steve.
Yes, it does. And a lot of his core, because I would hear people talk about how Steve's personality would also radically kind of shift from day to day. He was this kind of really lovable, happy, bubbly guy, and then all of a sudden it was like just disjointed. His brain almost was like
He'd be
revolting
bubbling for
against
the
him.
audience, but I think in his heart he was just a crabby dude. Not crabby in a bad way, just crabby. He was just crabby. That's okay. It's all right.
JerkComics, man. I feel
Yeah.
like
Yeah. But he used to show up at the office in his rundown old car, and he always took his dog with him wherever he went. And he left the dog in the car with the windows down and whatever. But the passenger side in his car was completely destroyed because he took his dog everywhere. He couldn't afford a new car. The dog had basically gone through the entire upholstery on the passenger side of his car. So you'd look in his car, go, "Hi, Steve, how you doing?" He'd look at the passenger seat, and the dog would be on one half of the seat, and the other half of the seat would just be springs, like springs and a couple of pieces of foam. And he because of maybe his physical his ailments, whatever it did to his mind, whatever, he really struggled to write. I mean, when he wrote, it was generally pretty darn good, but he struggled to keep up the production. And as he aged, that got worse. And as I'm aging, I understand exactly what that's about. Production gets harder as you get older. So he struggled with that, but he still needed the money. Like, right? The bills don't wait until you get inspired to finish your story. So we actually got to the point where Steve would drive from his place in the valley to the Malibu offices, sit at one of our desks, and we would pay him at the end of the day for the number of pages he wrote that day. So I love the guy, but it was always a struggle, and we didn't. There's still 2 or 3 issues, I think, of Sludge that Aaron Lopresti had to either plot and then Steve could script, or Aaron did it soup to nuts.
Man, that's
so every time you see the quirky crime stuff, that's all Steve. When you see Sludge versus other monsters, that's Aaron.
I love Steve to death, man, and like that's sad. That's sad to hear. That actually makes me really sad to hear, because I had wondered why his production had dropped off pretty severely, like past the early '90s. He just seemed like something wasn't right with him.
He genuinely struggled.
Yeah, you would read interviews and stuff, and it felt like there was just like this sense of foreboding hopelessness that surrounded him. And
in fairness, to be in his presence even during those days, and I understand the interviews you're talking about, if you were in the same room with Steve, you wouldn't feel that.
And as you said, I think I kind of read between the lines, knowing as much. One of the things that got me into doing very deep dives into what I call the controversy corner for, those stupid clickbaity titles, was Howard the Duck.
Right.
Gerber's treatment at the hands of Marvel and his absolute refusal to submit and kowtow to those guys. And I think Gerber was one of the big... It's weird that none of the Image guys ever brought him up, actually, because I think that he was one of the big rabble-rousers during the 80s, where it was like woke up guys like Dave Sim and Eastman and Laird and got them off of their guffs to be like, yeah, we should definitely create our own stuff, because there's room for that in the market.
One of the reasons Gerber was able to join the Ultraverse so freely was the fact that he wasn't an in-demand artist by the time Image came around. And Image was all about, excuse the term, but they were all about star fucking. I mean, and because it sold copies. I mean, I don't mean it as necessarily as big a pejorative as it sounds, but Steve's name didn't sell copies. So that's why the Image guys never went there, because they already knew how many copies they could sell. So the question is, who can I get that can help me sell even more copies?
It was just surprising, because like they all have this like big professed love of Kirby, and they got this close to Kirby being their figurehead, and like Kirby wouldn't have sold any comics for them at that point. That was prior to his death, and I'll tell you what, dude,
a lot of that's the warring factions within Image. You got 7 voices, and they're all, how much can you really get 7 guys with nothing to lose? how easy is it to get guys to agree on stuff at that point? Because then if you got nothing to lose, you're making decisions based on a whim.
Yeah. Like, how do
Right.
I feel today?
Yeah.
And speaking of weird decisions and people who might not necessarily be the easiest to work with, it was later on, but Rune by Barry Windsor Smith was another one I was curious about. Barry is a unique guy.
That's a nice way. That's a very nice way of putting it. Good for you.
I don't know how to take Barry. I honestly don't.
No, nobody does. I don't know anybody that does. So you're not alone.
Well, son of a bitch, because I was gonna ask. I was like,
no, I don't know. Barry's a perfectionist. Barry's got a very straight line vision of what he wants, and he wants other people to see and abide by the vision. If they veer too far from the vision, then there's a problem.
Yeah, to put it lightly.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't have a problem with Barry when it comes to those kinds of things, because he's very clear that what you see is what you get. And if you're willing to accept that, great. If you're not, don't do business with him. It's easy.
And that's cool to hear, because Barry doesn't do enough interviews. And I know that people who are as guarded and withdrawn and personal as he is don't do them for a very good reason. But it also leaves fans at the mercy of like people's interpretations of their actions and small quotations. And Barry Windsor Smith is one of those guys. I just got done doing a bunch of stuff on Weapon X, and I could find one interview that was like 4 pages long from Comic Scene where he talked about it, because he was just so done with Marvel at that point.
Sure. Did you see the interview he just did with Comics Experience for Monster?
I was gonna say I've got it saved on my YouTube. I've been so strapped for time trying to research this and do a bunch of stuff for the channel, and I've been slogging through this. I think it's like 10.5 hour long interview with a 4-hour addendum interview with Jim Shooter by Comic Book Historians. Okay, want to talk about the coloring, Marvel buyout, and then we can do a Geekview Tavern. Does that sound?
That's fine.
Okay.
So the truth is, Tom Mason on Facebook has documented it 7 different ways. The only reason that Marvel bought Malibu was because of the Image deal, which is this. Marvel was trying to negotiate its way into a sale, and Marvel could not, 100% could not ever, for their ego and their sales purposes, ever tolerate a headline that said DC overtakes Marvel as the #1 publisher. So if Marvel would have allowed DC to buy Malibu, our market share plus their market share, at least for a month or two, might have created a blip that DC would quote unquote be outselling Marvel for a while. In theory, that could have happened, and Marvel could not have that at all. And it was all because of the makeup guy who owned Marvel at the time, Revlon. It was the Revlon guy, whatever it was. Anyway, the Marvel was in such a financial strait at the time that they couldn't let that happen, because it would have seriously affected their investment stuff. So had nothing to do with our fabulous coloring department. And believe me, our coloring department was 3 shifts of 20 computers running 6 days a week. I mean, we had a night shift. We literally had kids working from 8 to 4, and then another set from working from 4 to midnight. And then we had another shift working from midnight to 8. I mean, it was 3 shifts of coloring comics. and they were great. And the first thing Marvel did when they got us was try to shut it down and kill it.
Really?
Yeah, because the guy that ran the Marvel's production department was getting a kickback from the coloring studio in Ireland. His name was Gene Durante, and he was a corrupt person. He was a bad person. He was a corrupt, bad person.
That's interesting because that's
so they walked in and literally tried to shoot the coloring department in the head.
Wow.
Because they wanted to send all of our work to Ireland, and they were going to send all of Marvel's work to Ireland too.
So the Marvel buyout happened in like 94, and I know you left by the middle of the next year in 95.
Yep.
The characters from Malibu were used in that second wave, and then an event by Marvel. But once they disappeared, they've never popped back up again. Joe Quesada and Tom Brevoort have both gone on record as saying that there is something weird about the way that that getting the characters was done in such a way that it prevents Marvel for some reason from using the characters. A lot of people stipulate that it's because they have to pay a percentage to anybody who's pertaining to the character who's alive or dead with like creation rights. But like that, Tom Brevoort has said publicly that that's not the case, but he also then refused to comment on why.
Tom Brevoort's right. I don't know. I can't say on the record that I know. I have a very good, wonderful. Wonderful is the wrong word. I do have a very good, credible guess.
Okay.
And I think it's got to do with executives at the studio that they don't want to work with, who have attached themselves to the properties.
Okay, so it does have to do with the perhaps maybe has to do with the amount of licensing that Rosenberg was involved with like a lot of the different properties and stuff, and talking to a lot of different people.
It would be interesting to know what his exit deal was.
All right. Sorry, I was just really curious about that. It's like one of those like weird urban myths almost going around,
right,
you know, about why Marvel will or won't use the characters. So after the Marvel buyout, you left from there. I know you worked for Late Humanoids for a little bit.
Couple of years, yep.
Yeah, and great company, put out some awesome stuff.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And then you did Gorilla, which was an imprint through Image, ironically.
Yeah, that cost me a lot of money. That cost a lot of people a lot of money.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I don't know if you have time or you'd like to discuss it all about Gorilla. I was curious about Gorilla.
Oh, I mean, I'm 100% to blame. It cost me a crap load of money. It cost a bunch of people a bunch of money. I got taken to the cleaners on good faith by a guy who said that he had the money to make Gorilla work, and he didn't. And so I extended my own personal dollars, and it was one of those things where he paid me just enough so I couldn't go running into the streets with my hair on fire, but eventually it all dried up. And so it cost the creators a lot of money. It cost me a lot of money, and it's all very sad, but it's, you know, I think I'm entirely to blame because I did not vet that investor properly.
All right. I was a big fan of Empire. I remember when Empire started coming out through Gorilla, and then what I think that finished through, I think DC, something like that.
Yeah. I really like Kurt's Shock Rockets.
Oh man, I never got a chance to read that. I heard about it.
Yeah, Stuart Immonen learning to be Stuart Immonen. It was great.
I love Stuart's stuff, man.
Yeah, Stuart's one of the most talented guys to ever work in the business, in my opinion.
He's really overlooked too. I've never understood why nobody like locks in on his stuff, and I never hear his name brought up a lot. Okay, so
he doesn't do. I mean, it doesn't help that he doesn't do press.
Is that it? Does he actually
It's one of the things. I mean, when's the last time you saw an interview with either him or You know, he just doesn't talk. He just didn't. He liked doing the work. He liked cashing the checks. I don't think he liked talking about it much.
Sometimes it's hard to tell whether or not they don't want to talk or nobody wants to talk to them prior to like the internet explosion of media outlets covering this stuff, you know, because if you weren't, I've seen 1,000,001 interviews with Todd McFarlane, but there are a lot of guys like Steve Gerber who were industry professionals for 30, 40 years who had huge fan bases when those publications were coming out. I didn't see interviews with them, so I didn't know.
I think if Gerber was alive today, he'd get a decent amount of coverage.
I think him and Mark,
if he wanted to, he wanted it.
Yeah, I think him and Mark Grunwald kind of fall into that same category of like guys who could get just as much exposure talking about their love of comics and history and how they see things as they could doing their actual stuff.
If you measure a man by his friends, Grunwald was quite the guy.
He fostered a love of comics in me that I'll be forever grateful for.
Well, he is well thought of by everyone that I've ever talked to.
So after all of that happened, you did make one more foray into comics that I'm aware of with Space Goat Productions. I really don't want to get off into like Space Goat. What
a colossal mess that turned out to be.
Oh my good God. When I was trying to do research on your work for them, I was like, I don't want to read about Evil Dead or
Right.
Terminator. Can I find anything that isn't about the Evil Dead Terminator board games? Oh yeah, Evil Dead. Oh no, shit, board games. Crap.
Yeah, it blew up in a horrible way. The thing you need to know about my participation is, one, Space Goat was in Washington State. I never moved from California. Two, the entire time I was there, I had a day job. So I was working a job either 32 or 40 hours a week and working for them 8 to 10 hours a week. So it wasn't even it was dabbling really. The goal was to keep some kind of presence in the comic book business because I love it. But the truth is, after Humanoids, I was pretty much shown the door.
Was there a specific reason for that, if you mind me asking?
There are a number of reasons. Most of them have to do, I think, with people don't know what I did. People can't see the value in me helping them. A lot of them, they see me as the guy that would come in and do what they do, so they don't want me to be, duplicating the process or whatever. It doesn't help them geographically disadvantaged. So for a lot of the time that I've been out, Marvel and DC were on the East Coast. Image was not going to hire me no matter what happened, but now they're in Northern California. So how many comic book jobs that I would be good for could I drive to from where I'm at? Because I already moved my wife once from Wisconsin to Connecticut, and then I moved her to Southern California, and she had a great job, and I wasn't going to ask her to give up her career again for me. So my job was then to just get a day job that would pay the bills and try to make the best of it.
Absolutely fair enough. I just was curious. When I was talking to Mesner Loebs, he had been doing all of this great work for DC, and then he went and did the Max. And while he was busy doing the Max, all the editors he worked with basically just phased out into writers and artists and this kind of stuff. And by the time he came back, he didn't have any contacts, and it turned into this dry spell that's lasted 30 years for him now.
Yeah, well, figure when was 9/11? Do you know?
2001.
2000 or 2001?
Yeah.
So basically, I've been out of comics in any sort of functioning way for probably about 22 years.
It's In my opinion, it's a great loss to the medium. The level of
Nice,
thought.
nice of you to say. If I could find somebody with about $5 million, I could solve that.
God, I know that feeling. Oh, if I could find someone with just $1 million to give me, I could rule the world, I tell you. But you know, you like you said, you made your foray with Space Goat just to kind of
keep my hand in, just so I could go to a convention as a professional,
yeah,
without going, yeah, I was a professional 20 years ago. Just so that I could have a business card I could hand to people.
And then after
just to have standing, you know.
And so after that, you kind of have bowed out of the industry.
Not voluntarily.
Are you still looking? You know, would you still entertain?
I would look, but I'm a 61-year-old man.
I was just curious if you would even entertain working.
I've interviewed 3 times at DC. Never got tapped to work there. So, and now my skills are pretty atrophied in terms of ask me to be a social media manager. Good luck. I mean, I know the stuff to do. I don't know the lingo. I don't know the catchphrases. I don't know like how to describe in a job interview that I could do the job, even if I could do it. I don't know how to describe it in a way that makes any sense.
No, absolutely.
And the job search process is a nightmare for everybody involved. And it's horrible from the hiring side, and it's horrible from the being hired side. So, you know.
Yeah, and monetarily, I don't assume it's something worth expending an extreme amount of time and energy chasing down at this point.
So now I've got my day job is I work from my house. I work doing Zoom meetings all day long, coaching people how to use a particular software package. That's it. Easy. Company treats me well, reimburses me over all my expenses, pays for my travel.
So following Space Goat, you have started your own YouTube channel, which is kind of how you came across, I think, my video and ended up posting on there, and we ended up getting together and talking. Can you talk a little bit about Geekview Tavern?
Sure. So the idea was, I mean, me and my buddies always have these really great discussions, not unlike this one, and as a matter of fact. They tend to be a little more raucous. There's a lot more joke. I mean, we've told a few jokes, but they tend to be pretty entertaining. And I thought, you know what? I see other people doing YouTube, and a lot of it is heavily informational, and the stuff that's designed to be entertaining sometimes isn't very much. It's a talking head barking at me or giving me directions, and then you look into the background of the guy that's barking at you and you realize they don't know shit. You know, that happens a lot. So I thought, you know what? I love talking to my friends. I've got a lot of great friends with a lot of great opinions. We have a really great time. What in the world am I going to call this? My friend said, you should name it after yourself. And I was like, you know, something doesn't seem right about that. And I mean, at one point, I considered calling it Dave Olbrich and His Amazing Friends, which I thought was kind of a weird throwback, but I didn't go with that. I think Geekview Tavern says what I want it to say. I think in terms of a name, it says it's about geeky stuff. It says that we're viewing it kind of from the outside, and it also says that it's just a bunch of guys sitting around over beers talking about their geeky interests. And if you pick the right bunch of guys, it can be really entertaining and it can be informational. So that's kind of the goal. Relax it a little bit and have it be a discussion, not a sermon. I don't know. Maybe people like it. Maybe they won't. I've made 10 of them so far. They've had varying degrees of success. I'd certainly like to have more success. So if you want to hear me and my friends, especially, my friends are way funnier than I am. Stop by and the cool thing is you can say, stop by the tavern and we can, once the COVID is over, Tom and I want to do live feeds from actual taverns. and maybe just have iPads, like we're all sitting around the same table, but we're talking into our iPads, so we're recording it on Zoom. And I think it could be cool. And we could do, I mean, eventually we do like Kevin Smith does with his ridiculous things where he actually invites an audience to come and watch them record their podcast. I mean, who knows? Ultimately, it's fun. And the best thing about it is, and I don't know if you experience this, teaching myself to edit videos has been fun. I mean, I enjoy it. I wish I had more time to do it. I wish life didn't get in the way of me doing it. And I like the results. I just need more viewers and subscribers. That's all.
Yeah, I think YouTube is a wonderful way of like allowing yourself to like grow and expand and do all this stuff that you have an interest in, and then finding new stuff that you're interested in. I am not a big fan of the editing process. Because it's a little bit more laborious for like from my side. I'm like cutting out quotes from magazines, and I have to scan magazines and catalog them. And then
well, you do what I do, which is a lot of pop-ups into the live feed, right? So to give what you're talking about context. I think it makes it more it's way more valuable than the guys that don't do that. I think
I do too, but it's like
it is a lot of work.
Yeah,
I worked on one piece of video about just like Marvel characters that might be big in the movie someday. I worked on editing that one and putting pop-ups in for like 6 weeks. It's crazy.
Yeah, I am so close. I cannot wait to get it out. But I did a Bernard Krigstein documentary, and like it was the first time I ever set out to really do anything full scope magnitude coverage of an entire career the same way I did that Image, where, I'm throwing out dates and names and quotes for every little thing, because I don't want it to be my supposition or this is what happened according to those involved.
So does this happen to you at some point in the editing process? You started to realize, when I post this on YouTube, it might be there forever.
And ever and ever. And like,
so that does cross your mind too, right? Like, I think about, you know what? I'll just short arm this one and I'll put it out, and who's going to care? And then I think, oh no, I freaking can't do that because this is going to exist forever. Yep. Probably.
Yeah, and it was like a problem in the beginning, but then once the majority of my viewers are like guys who are my age that are really into comics, or guys who have written and drawn or writing and drawing and working for the industry. Sure. And like, while that is an extreme compliment to me, it also makes me weary of like, dude, this needs to look right, because these guys do layouts. They work in a visual medium. If it looks like crap, it's going to be insulting to them.
And you don't want to get your facts wrong.
And if I say anything, I'm triple vetting stuff now, because there's been like once or twice where I've said one or two things that were direct quotes, and like they were wrong, and I own up to it. I am totally not one of those guys. It's like I did a Rob Liefeld Hawk and Dove episode about for the controversy corner.
Yeah.
And like, while I put it out 2 days after 2 days before I put it out, after I finished editing it, he put out a podcast talking about it. And and of course Rob went back on all this stuff where he'd slammed on Carl and Barb. So like, or Barbara, excuse me. But
hey, look at you! You know now. You know the Barbara thing.
Exactly. You taught me. I learned something from you.
I didn't tell you the Barbara thing. I told you the Walter thing. You already knew the Barbara thing from somebody else.
But no, I stopped and I was like, no, it's not Barb. It's not Walt. It's Barbara.
That's right.
I learned that from you, sir.
Barbara. That's right.
Yeah, but
I know well enough to call her Barbara. I do. I know.
But
I'm in the club.
But she was involved with it, and Rob for years was like, the ink stinked on Hawk and Dove and blah blah blah. And now like he's all like, well, I don't have a problem with Carl, and I very much like, and it was cool because they have this.
You ever met Carl? He's kind of a sweetheart.
No, he is in any interview that you ever read with him, even when they goad him into being like, yes, Rob Liefeld sent me pages of art without hands and feet. That's about what you get out of him. Not like, oh yes, this young snot-nosed punk.
Yeah,
And
no, Carl's a pretty good guy. Yeah.
he seems very much like it. And it
Yep.
was upsetting to know that like Liefeld is also being an adult about the situation, and I did not get to give both of them equal credit in that, of both being like, no, it's 30 years down the line, it's not a big deal. But I'm sorry. Again, derailing off here into crazy.
So you've
territory.
watched a few episodes of Geekview Tavern. Do you have a favorite that you've watched? Do you what's your, tell your viewers what your impressions of Geekview Tavern are so far?
My favorite thing about Geekview Tavern is that, much like cartoonist kayfabe, there is an insider angle to it. So you're gonna get stories or even offhanded remarks, just like little one-liners about people's personalities or certain events. And I've caught these a couple of times going through, where it will illuminate something new or different about that person, character, or event in a way that someone outside of the industry would be completely incapable of doing. They just wouldn't have that level of insight into someone on a daily basis. Much like your discussion of Steve Gerber and his writing today. It's little things, I think, that I enjoy the most about it. Another thing that I also really like is that a lot of stuff that has to deal with the industry is extremely straight. Like me, it's dry, it's informational. It might not necessarily be fun to watch. I do try to make things interesting, and interesting should be fun. But, you know, like trying
it can be a real struggle. I hear you.
You know, convincing people like, hey, you want to learn, watch education. You know, I had this new joke at the end of my episode.
Eat that broccoli. Come on, eat that broccoli.
I'm now officially the Jerk Broadcasting Company, because I'm the PBS of comics. That's what I want to be.
There you go.
Yeah. But convincing people to take that jump is not always easy. Stuff like Geekview Tavern, where you kind of can dip your toe in, and you don't have to be staring intently at the screen, watching every single quote that comes up and little visual. If you're watching, the visual cues are awesome, and it's great to see people's personalities showing through, but it's very auditory as well, and you can listen to it and take a lot away from it. As well, I think the last thing that I would say that I find interesting about Geekview Tavern is your choice of topics, because like you refer to yourself as having a very antiquated set of skills when it comes to creating comic books, and like the knowledge of that. But I think that it also allows you to see the cartoons, comic strips, media, films in a very different way. And so when you guys approach stuff that is not necessarily Superman issue 411, where John Byrne pointed out that Clark Kent was invisible to other people when wearing his glasses because of purple kryptonite that gave it.
If you try to listen to any of the Marvel podcasts, like they've got like 10 of them, and I think like there's one that's mildly interesting. Otherwise, they're young people with really boring things to say. I hate to say it that way, but they just bore me to death.
It's the majority of YouTube channels that do it's just like in issue 411, this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens, and it's like, did nobody else want to read these comics? Why am I what? Like, anyway, so, but you know, when you guys approach stuff, whether it be you know, Tom and Jerry, or the last one I think you got, I said Tom and Jerry. The last one I think you Bill and Calvin and Hobbes was on the on the
thumbnail.
Yeah, I haven't gotten a chance to check it out, but just the fact that you guys deal with like and Ed Piskor, Jim Rugg, again, cartoonist kayfabe kind of pull in, because they've got a very strong viewership. So that's why I keep drawing parallels of things that people might enjoy. Because I
love the fact that they stole a wrestling term. I just find that hysterical.
I've got an Andre the Giant tattoo on my leg. So
there you go.
When I saw a cartoonist kayfabe, I was like, Okay, yeah, I am signed up. I don't even know what this is about. Subscribe.
When I've had a couple too much to drink and I'm just sitting there with my iPad, sometimes I spend time trying to find a decent Bobby Eaton t-shirt. Like this really great wrestler nobody knows that like was on TV for like 20 years and nobody really knows who he is. I'm totally obsessed with Bobby Eaton because he almost never talked.
No, he was like one of the few guys who you can't get and just do a million.
He had this really bad Southern accent, so they never let him talk. And in the ring, he was like Steve Austin said he's a surgeon. Bobby Eaton is a surgeon in terms of working in the ring. And watching him work now, the smarter I am, boy, oh boy. Yeah, I just watched the end of a Road Warriors match the other night, and Jesus Christ, he's good. Anyway, sorry,
no, sorry. Dude, he's absolutely amazing.
Thing to talk about Bobby Eaton. I'm sorry.
Oh my God! Like I haven't derailed about a half a dozen times in this entire interview. Like, come on, man. No, dude. But I'm a big wrestling fan. I used to work at a tattoo shop, and the piercer there and me would just spend hours watching historical wrestling matches and stuff. Because when I was growing up during the heyday of it, and I didn't really respect it for the showmanship. It was just too much for me in this carnival aspect. And the older I fell in love with like Andre as a human being, and then it got me into like and it's funny because you mentioned like Bobby Eaton, and I was just listening to Jim Corrigan. I don't know if you or Jim Cornette. I don't know.
Yeah, I love Jim Cornette. I've got when I'm working and if I'm not on the phone, I got the Jim Cornette experience just like running in the background.
I was gonna say, dude, I was hearing him talk about Bobby Eaton not too long ago, and he had some really cool stuff to say about him. So I was like, yeah, no, I feel you. I've been on a.
Well, I told Tom the hot list. If we can ever get our subscribers and our viewers up high enough, my hit list is to get some of the wrestlers who really are into comics to come on. Get Mark Henry. He's super into comics. Get Hurricane Helms. Oh my God, he'd be great. There's all sorts of guys. Chris Jericho, for God's sake, is into comics. So I'd love to talk to those guys about not really about wrestling. I want to talk to them about why they love comics and what comics they're reading. And like, I've got all sorts of curiosities that need to be fed. So I might be the perfect YouTube host just because I'm curious about all sorts of crazy shit.
And that would be the last thing I would mention, I guess, actually, is your natural love. You are like Rob Liefeld. And I don't mean that in a negative way.
I'm taking it the best way possible. Fair enough.
I'm sorry. That came out.
No, like don't be sorry. It's okay.
But of anything you can say about Rob, he continues to work in the industry, not because of money, not because of a need to work in the industry, not because he can't do anything else, not because he doesn't want to, because he loves comic books. Yep. And that is something that you continuously bring to every aspect of anything.
He doesn't have to spend time on that dumb podcast. Why does he do it?
I
mean, literally, like he can spending time with his kids, his wife, whatever. And you know as well as I do, that podcast takes 5 times longer than just the time he takes to record it, just screwing around with it.
Oh yeah.
And yet he's dedicated to telling those stories, and God bless him.
Yeah, but you seem the very same. Dedicated after all these years in and out of the industry, ups, downs, spec booms, busts, come or go, come what may of the industry. You love it and you respect the industry. That is something you rarely see enough from industry professionals or ex-professionals. And if anybody's thinking about checking out Geekview Tavern, that would be the number one thing that I would tell you, is that anything that they approach, anything that they discuss, no matter how funny or out there, or
bring your sense of humor, but we're there because we love it.
I was going to say it is approached with a sense of honest to goodness love.
Yeah, and we make fun of it. There's no question. No question. We make fun of it all the time, but it's only, like you say, out of love. And Tom and I were talking about that just the other day. It's like, you know what? Even though we're making fun of it, I think it comes through how much we respect and love what we're talking about. So
it does.
I think he's right about that.
It really, I can agree with that as a complete outsider. I can totally agree with that. So I will let you go now. It has been like 3.5 hours. Thank you from the bottom, from the subcockles of my heart, for taking the time to humor all of my ridiculously inane questions and talk about all this amazing stuff. I know we plugged Geekview, and we talked about an inane amount of things.
You want a really great, if you want a really great Steve Gerber story, and I think that you do, go watch the Geekview Tavern episode about Hawkeye's worst mistake.
Ooh, okay. I know what I'm doing after we get off here.
It'll take you 20 minutes, and I think you'll be very amused. Text me or email me afterwards and tell me how amused you are by the story.
All right, man. Wait, is there anything that you would like to bring up, talk, or discuss before we go?
Nope. This has been so fun, and it's so great to get to know you. I think you and I will be talking or trading emails more, I think, as we go forward. Yeah, I'm a big fan. So keep up the good work, my friend.
I really appreciate it, man. Again, thank you so much for doing this. Thank you guys all for sticking with me. And there will be links to Geekview Tavern in the description below, so you can check that out. Is there any other... You don't do Facebook or anything from what I understand? I was talking
Not
to
yet.
People. Okay. I just wanted to make sure.
One step at a time. I'm barely managing YouTube, so...
You are absolutely fine. I just wanted to make sure, so my viewers know where to find you. So
if I'm on Facebook all the time, and I've got a Twitter handle. It's just Dave Olbrich. I'm not particularly hard to find. I've got a Instagram as well, but I don't know what to do with it. I'm still learning exactly the interface of how Instagram works. But yeah, I'm not hard to find. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Twitter, and it's just Dave Olbrich. It's exactly what you'd expect.
Well, you guys can find links to all of that stuff in the description below. If you have not, do yourself a favor, go back, check out some of the Malibu work. I cannot recommend stuff like Prime. Dinosaurs for Hire is absolutely amazing. The X Mutants, once they took that over with the Shattered World Chronicles, was very, very cool. That's been brought up by numerous fans who turned me on to that, so thank you guys for that. There's just innumerable stuff from Malibu that I think is extremely overlooked because Image was there doing this whole crazy thing, and Marvel and DC were going off the absolute rails at that point. So do yourself a favor and check out some books you might not have given a chance. Thank you so much for sticking with me, Dave. Thank you guys for sticking with me again. And as always, guys, I really, truly, and honestly ask only two things. Keep hitting those local shops. Keep reading comics.